Hi everyone, and welcome back to Crime Whisper. I know you can't sleep, so let me keep you company with another chilling true crime story from around the world. Before we dive in, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. And if you enjoy this kind of content, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Now let's jump straight into tonight's story. Main story: the disappearance of Katie Poole. The disappearance of 19-year-old college student Katie Poole is one of those rare cases that baffled investigators to such an extent that even NASA experts were consulted during the search, despite the massive effort. Katie was never found alive. Vanishing sent shockwaves through the nation, but nowhere was the impact felt more deeply than in the peaceful town of Moose Lake, Minnesota, where Katie had lived and studied. Katie Elizabeth Poole was born on February 28, 1980, in the quiet town of Duluth, located in St. Louis County, Minnesota. She was the second child in a warm and loving family. She shared a close bond with her older brother, and from an early age, she was known for her creativity, energy, and outgoing personality. When Katie started school, her family moved to nearby Carleton County and settled in the small town of Barnum there. Katie blossomed into an artistic and ambitious young woman. She loved singing, played the guitar, and eventually became a performer in a local band. She also had a huge heart for animals, volunteering at shelters and helping with park cleanups. Her beauty and charm were undeniable. In high school, she competed in a local beauty pageant and proudly took home second place after graduating. Katie moved to Moose Lake to attend college, where she pursued a degree in criminal law. Her fiancé Mark, whom she had been dating for a few years, studied computer technology at the same university. They lived together in a cozy apartment and were saving up for their wedding while working part-time jobs to stay financially independent. Katie worked night shifts at a gas station located near a busy highway. She liked the flexible schedule, which allowed her to juggle school, work, and her relationship, but her parents were uneasy. The gas station sat along a major route connecting several cities, attracting all kinds of people at all hours. Still, Katie assured them it was safe. The station had multiple surveillance cameras, and a popular 24-hour diner nearby kept the area fairly busy. Even at night. Disappearance on May 26, 1999. Katie reported to work for her usual night shift. She switched shifts with a colleague and took over around 10 p.m. Everything seemed routine around midnight. A woman pulled up to the gas station to fill her tank. Afterward, she entered the store to pay and grab some snacks, but when she approached the register, there was no one there. Puzzled, she waited. After a few minutes, with no sign of an employee, she cautiously walked toward the utility room and called out, "No." Answer: the store was wide open. The lights were on, the doors were unlocked, but Katie was gone after about 10 minutes. The woman called the police. Initial investigation. Officers arrived quickly and began inspecting the area. Nothing was out of place. There were no signs of forced entry, no struggle, no blood, and no indication of robbery. The cash register still held all its money at first. Investigators considered the possibility that Katie had stepped out or left in a hurry, but her car was still parked outside, and inside the store were her purse, house keys, and car keys. She hadn't taken a single personal belonging. Her sudden disappearance began to look far more sinister. Katie's parents were notified, and they were adamant Katie would never abandon her responsibilities like that. Her fiancé agreed something was terribly wrong. The case was now classified as a missing person investigation, and the gas station was treated as a potential crime scene. Security footage. Police reviewed security footage from the 4 surveillance cameras inside the store. Each one had a clear view of a different part of the interior. The early hours of Katie's shift appeared completely normal. She restocked shelves, served customers, and nothing seemed off until around 11 p.m. My young woman entered the store and chatted with Katie for around 10 minutes. She didn't buy anything, but seemed friendly, possibly a friend or classmate. After that, the woman left. Then, about 30 minutes later, a man entered the store. He looked around briefly, then walked back out moments later. He returned by this point. Katie had gone to the back. Continued the surveillance clue and identification efforts. The man who had briefly left the store soon re-entered, but this time, something felt off. Footage showed that Katie had just gone into the back room, and it appeared the man had been watching her from outside, through the glass door. Once inside, he made his way directly toward the back. Unfortunately, that part of the store had no camera coverage, so what exactly transpired there remains unknown. But a few minutes later, both Katie and the man emerged from the back room. This time, it was clear something was terribly wrong. The man walked closely behind, or gripping her hair in one hand, while pressing the other hand against her back, likely holding a weapon, though no weapon was clearly visible. His body language suggested a threat, either a knife or a gun. Katie appeared tense, her movements forced. She was being abducted, right from her workplace. This critical footage provided the first major break in the investigation, but it also presented major obstacles. Despite the presence of cameras inside the store, there were none outside. Not at the adjoining gas station, not in the parking lot, and not along the adjacent highway. As a result, investigators had no footage showing where the suspect took Katie, what kind of vehicle he used, or in which direction he fled. Given that the area was relatively isolated, with nothing but a highway stretching in both directions, it was unlikely that he could have forced her away on foot without someone noticing. The logical assumption was that he led her straight into a waiting vehicle, possibly parked out of frame, and drove off. Another challenge: the security footage was from 1999, black and white, grainy, low-resolution. Technology was limited, and image quality made it difficult to identify defining features. Even with this critical lead, creating a facial composite was no easy task. Law enforcement, along with dozens of volunteers, launched an immediate search of the surrounding area, combing through fields, woods, ditches, and roadside stops, but nothing of significance was found. The witness, Melinda's account: investigators quickly reached out to the young woman seen talking to Katie earlier that night. Her name was Melinda, a friend, fellow student, and part-time waitress at a nearby diner. Melinda confirmed that she'd stopped by to check on Katie during her shift. But what she revealed next added a disturbing twist. Earlier that evening, while working her own shift, Melinda had noticed a strange man inside the diner. He had approached a customer and then another woman in the parking lot, attempting to flirt or initiate conversations. Both women rejected him and left separately. His behavior was described as unsettling, persistent, not overtly threatening, but definitely inappropriate. Melinda's shift ended at 11 o'clock p.m. Around the time Katie's troubles began. As she was locking up the diner, the same man returned. He asked her what time the restaurant would open the next morning, a question she found odd, given the circumstances. Uneasy, she warned Katie about the man and suggested calling the police, but Katie reassured her the store had plenty of cameras, everything would be fine. Melinda also remembered something crucial: the man drove a black Ford F-150 pickup truck. As she left the parking lot, he pulled out shortly after and overtook her quickly on the highway. She recalled part of his license plate, the numbers 52 to 57 and the letter Y. That partial plate would prove to be an important clue, but in the late 90s, there was no comprehensive national vehicle database tracking it down. Took time building a profile with Melinda's description and another vague account from a gas station customer. A profile began to form. The suspect was believed to be a white male between 35 and 40 years old, with long blonde hair and no noticeable accent. He wore a baseball cap pulled low, obscuring much of his face due to the low-quality footage. These observations were the best the police had. That's when investigators made a bold move. They reached out to NASA. Specialists used image-enhancing technology, originally developed for astronomical purposes, to analyze and clean up the surveillance footage. Despite the suspect never facing the camera directly, technicians managed to reconstruct a clearer image enough to produce a composite portrait. The enhanced image was distributed across Minnesota to law enforcement agencies, media outlets, and eventually, national news viewers were urged to report anyone matching the image or driving a similar vehicle, and soon, the tips began pouring in false leads, and the real break police were flooded with calls, some helpful, most not. Just days later, a man was detained who closely resembled the suspect in the composite image. He even had a criminal history involving robbery and harassment, but there was one glaring issue. He had a full-sleeve tattoo, something not visible in the security footage. He was quickly ruled out. Still, one specific detail began to stand out in the surveillance video. The suspect was seen wearing a New York Yankees t-shirt with the number 23 on it. Melinda recalled that when he spoke to her outside the diner, he was dressed differently, but when shown the footage, she was certain it was the same man. Then, a week later, police received a call from Minneapolis. Man claimed the composite sketch looked eerily similar to his neighbor, a reclusive janitor named Donald Hutchinson. He drove a black Ford F-150 pickup truck and, oddly enough, had recently cut his long blonde hair and begun growing a beard. Even more suspicious, around the time of Katie's disappearance, he abruptly quit his job without any explanation. Conclusion of the Blom case: justice, confession, and legacy. With mounting evidence, law enforcement finally had the legal grounds to arrest Donald Blom. He was detained pending trial, and what followed would expose a terrifying portrait of a man who had lived a double life for decades. On June 22, 1999, Blom was formally charged in court. He entered a plea of not guilty, retained legal counsel, and initially claimed he would fully cooperate to prove his innocence. But behind closed doors, a different story was unfolding. During a more exhaustive search of his belongings, police discovered multiple unlicensed firearms, another charge in the making. Then, suddenly, Blom began to confess. He admitted to kidnapping Katie from the store, bringing her to his remote property, where he strangled her to death, and burned her body to destroy the evidence. He denied sexually assaulting her, claiming he had been too intoxicated from a mix of alcohol and illegal substances. Blom stated he used only firewood and paper to incinerate Katie's remains, but forensic experts strongly disagreed. The extent of cremation observed at the scene suggested the use of chemical accelerants or fuel, which Blom never admitted to using. He also detailed his movements that evening while at a nearby gas station. He had initially planned to follow Melinda, Katie's friend, but he changed his mind, overtook her on the road, drove home, changed clothes, and returned to the store where Katie was working. This accounted for the discrepancies in what he was reportedly wearing, according to various witness statements. But just 2 weeks later, Blom retracted his confession, claiming it had been coerced, that authorities had threatened harm against him and his wife unless he confessed. His wife backed up this version of events, testifying that he had been home with her the entire night and never left the residence yet. The evidence told another story during the trial. 2 women who had survived Blom's earlier attacks in 1983 came forward and bravely took the stand. They painted a chilling picture of a man who took pleasure in domination, control, and cruelty. Their testimonies revealed a disturbing pattern of sadistic behavior that echoed what had happened to Katie, combined with forensic evidence, including the unique dental filling, the truck, the concealed burn site, and the confession. The jury reached a unanimous decision. Donald Blom was found guilty. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Aftermath and additional revelations. In a shocking post-trial interview, Blom's wife admitted she had lied under oath to protect herself and her children. She confessed that her husband had physically abused them for years, and that she had lived in constant fear. Shortly after the trial, she changed her last name, took the children, and moved out of state to start over, far from his shadow. Meanwhile, investigators continued to dig deeper based on Blom's history and the nature of Katie's murder. Detectives suspected he was a serial predator. He was linked, though, never formally charged, to several unsolved disappearances of young women in particular. Police believed he may have been responsible for the strangling of Wilma Johnson in 1983, the 1993 abduction and murder of student Holly Spangler, though no conclusive evidence surfaced in those cases. The suspicion lingered, and Katie's case became the one that finally ended his reign of terror in 2021. Blom was quietly transferred to MCF, a medium security facility with looser restrictions. He reportedly referred to it as a vacation after public outcry and pressure from Katie's family. He was moved back to the high-security Stillwater prison. Donald Blom died on January 10, 2023, at age 73. Legacy and media coverage: Katie Puis. Tragic story has been extensively covered in media and true crime documentaries. Kellen's Forensic Files aired a haunting episode titled Tooth or Consequences, based on her case. The Discovery Channel's The New Detectives featured the case in an episode called Fatal Abduction in 2010. A powerful documentary titled From the Ashes was produced, using real evidence, interviews, and archived material from the investigation. Story is a stark reminder of how evil can wear an ordinary face, and how even in quiet towns, predators may walk unnoticed for years. New case begins. The tragedy of Diogo Gonçalves. Now, let's take a journey across the Atlantic to the sunlit shores of southern Portugal for another story of tragedy, trust, and betrayal. On March 20, 2020, 20-year-old Diogo Gonçalves left his home in the picturesque resort town of Albufeira to meet a girl he had long admired. What should have been a romantic evening would instead become a horrific nightmare, one that no one, especially not Diogo, could have predicted. Albufeira, nestled in Portugal's popular Algarve region, is known for its scenic coastline, cobbled streets, and warm hospitality, but beneath its postcard charm, something sinister was about to unfold. Born in 1999, Diogo was the only child of a hard-working, modest family. Their income relied heavily on the seasonal swings of tourism. To those who knew him, Diogo was the definition of a good son, respectful, responsible, and full of heart. Friends described him as outgoing, loyal, and generous, someone who always made time for those he loved. He graduated from high school in his hometown, then pursued a degree in computer science to support both his education and help at home. Diogo began working at McDonald's at age 16, but in 2015, life took a dark and unexpected turn. She eventually succumbed to her injuries, though the driver initially fled the scene. Law enforcement was able to track him down and bring him to justice, while legal proceedings against those responsible for his parents' fates were underway. It became clear that Diogo's father required placement in a specialized medical facility due to his condition. Recognizing the hardship Diogo faced, his maternal aunt invited him to live with her. Unfortunately, the arrangement quickly soured due to irreconcilable differences, making cohabitation impossible. Confiding in a friend about his struggles, Diogo was offered a place to stay by the friend's parents. They welcomed him into their home in the Alvor neighborhood of The familiarity of the area and the warmth of the family helped ease some of his burdens. Despite his young age, Diogo showed remarkable emotional strength, managing life's challenges with patience and quiet resilience. By 18, Diogo had completed his degree in computer technology. In 2017, he landed a 6-month internship at the prestigious 5-star Vita Park Hotel. His dedication and professionalism impressed his supervisors, leading to a job offer. Upon completion of his internship, he gladly accepted the position in 2018 and left his job at a fast food chain, where he had worked for several years and even earned the role of duty manager. Life finally seemed to be turning around for Diogo. He bought a car and began forming solid friendships at his new workplace. Among them was 19-year-old Maria Malva, a security guard at the Hotel. Maria, like Diogo, came from humble beginnings. Her childhood had been shaped by her mother's mental illness and her father's early abandonment. Maria dreamed of joining the police force, but was disqualified due to a tattooing obstacle that led her to pursue private security training. Instead, Diogo was instantly drawn to Maria. He admired her strength and was vocal about his feelings from the beginning, but Maria kept her distance. She made it clear that she wasn't interested in a romantic relationship, citing the emotional fallout from a toxic past relationship with a naval officer. Despite her rejections, she gave Diogo mixed signals. Spending time with him and accepting his gifts and dinner invitations, they grew so close that others often assumed they were a couple, even though Maria continued to assert they were just friends. According to Fabio Asta, one of Diogo's closest friends, Diogo had become emotionally invested, perhaps even obsessed. He declined a lucrative job opportunity at the Sheraton hotel chain in Lisbon simply because he didn't want to move away from Maria. He frequently brought her meals during her shifts and offered to walk her home, though she always declined, saying her roommate's boyfriend didn't allow men in the apartment. Then came a turning point. Diogo saw a video on social media showing Maria kissing another girl. He was heartbroken. He believed she had led him on and should have been honest. If she wasn't interested in men, Fabio tried to reassure him, suggesting that such behavior didn't necessarily define her sexuality. But Diogo remained upset, convinced he had been misled despite the incident. Their friendship continued. Maria still accepted his attention, gifts, and companionship. Then, in December 2019, Diogo received long-awaited compensation for his mother's death, around 70,000 euros. With the money, he began planning to buy a home and escape the cycle of renting. He shared the exciting news with Maria not long after. Maria abruptly resigned from her hotel job. She explained that the gossip about her supposed relationship with Diogo had become unbearable, and she needed more time to care for her ailing mother. At first, her decision seemed reasonable, but events that followed cast doubt on her explanation and hinted at far darker motives. Enter Mariana Fona, a 20-year-old nurse working at the local hospital. She was Maria's live-in partner, and the two had a stable romantic relationship, though financial hardship prevented them from living truly independently. The women had moved into Mariana's parents' house to save money, while continuing their relationship in secret. After learning about the substantial compensation Diogo was due to receive 70,000 euros for the wrongful death of his mother, behavior toward him changed noticeably. She began drawing closer to him, a shift that many now believe was calculated. It's likely she shared this financial detail with her girlfriend, Mariana Fona. From that point on, the two women began plotting together, developing a plan to deceive Diogo, access his banking information, and ultimately steal his money. For weeks, Diogo had persistently refused to share his personal details or banking information with Maria, but one day, she surprised him. She told him she wanted to spend a romantic evening together. To Diogo, who had long been in love with her, it seemed like a dream finally coming true. Overwhelmed with emotion, he could hardly believe that the girl he had loved from afar for so long was now offering herself to him. Their date was scheduled for Friday evening, March 20th, 2020. Diogo was elated. He never questioned Maria's sudden change of heart. Perhaps, after everything he'd done for her, she had finally seen the sincerity of his love. Sadly, he couldn't have been more wrong, though. Maria and Mariana would later provide conflicting accounts of what happened that night. What follows is based on police records and verified media reports. When Diogo arrived at the apartment that evening, Mariana was also present. Though she kept her distance, Maria offered Diogo a glass of orange juice, something seemingly innocent, but laced with a powerful sedative. The drink had been spiked with 3 ampoules of diazepam, DMA, a central nervous system depressant with anesthetic and tranquilizing properties. Mariana had stolen the drug from the hospital where she worked as a nurse. The plan was simple. Once Diogo passed out, Maria would use his fingers to unlock his phone and access his banking apps, allowing the women to transfer his compensation money, while Maria executed the plan inside the apartment. Mariana waited outside in her car, texting repeatedly to check if the sedative had taken effect, but the drug wasn't acting as quickly as expected, and tensions began to rise inside the apartment. Diogo grew confused and increasingly uncomfortable, sensing his suspicion. Maria tried to divert his attention. She promised him a sensual experience on erotic dance, but told him it would be more exciting if he let her tie him to a table. Naively trusting her, Diogo agreed as he lay restrained. Anxiety overtook him. He begged Maria to untie him, but instead of freeing him, she turned violent, using her martial arts training. Maria overpowered him, bringing him down and locking her arms around his neck, cutting off his air supply according to Mariana. Maria then called her into the apartment. When Mariana entered, she found Diogo unconscious on the floor. She immediately questioned why Maria had deviated from their original plan, which was only to drug Diogo and steal his money. Panicking, the women attempted to revive him. Mariana administered basic resuscitation, and Diogo eventually regained consciousness, but in a frenzied state. Likely realizing what had been done to him, he lashed out, attempting to attack Mariana. In response, Maria intervened again. She grabbed Diogo from behind, forced him to the ground, and once more applied a chokehold. This time, fatally, Diogo's tragic death occurred at the hands of the woman he adored. His body was left in the living room of the apartment Maria and Mariana shared, rather than seek help. The women immediately proceeded with their plan to rob him. They cut off Diogo's thumb and index finger, using them to unlock his phone and access his mobile banking apps, because the apps had daily transfer limits. It took several days to withdraw the entire amount. Coincidentally, the murder happened just as COVID-19 lockdowns were beginning. Remote work and restricted travel had become the new norm. Diogo was due at work the following day, but to avoid raising suspicion, Maria and Mariana used his phone to send a message to one of his IT colleagues. The message claimed Diogo couldn't make it in and needed someone to cover for him. This immediately raised eyebrows. Diogo was known for being highly reliable and would never miss work without notice. When coworkers followed up, asking if everything was alright, Diogo's phone replied with vague reassurances. Text exchanges continued through Friday and into Saturday, but the tone and phrasing seemed off, too impersonal, too unlike Diogo. Then came a bizarre message. Diogo had supposedly met a French woman and decided to move in with her. This stunned his supervisor. It was wildly out of character. Sensing something was wrong, the supervisor tried calling, but no one answered. Another message arrived, claiming Diogo wasn't in a state to talk. His boss replied firmly. He needed to hear Diogo's voice to be sure he was okay. As the women realized suspicion was mounting, they scrambled to change their narrative. They decided to fake Diogo's suicide. Even more disturbingly, they began discussing how to dispose of his body. Maria later confessed that their inspiration for this part of the plan came from the TV series Dexter, which depicts a forensic expert who kills criminals and hides his crimes through elaborate dismemberment techniques. They believed that by dismembering Diogo's body and scattering the remains, they could erase all evidence of the murder. This chilling turn of events not only underscored the brutality of their actions, but also exposed how quickly a chain of lies, erratic messages, and failed cover-ups can unravel and lead investigators straight to the truth. Despite their efforts to mislead everyone searching for the truth, it was only a matter of time before the horrors they committed were uncovered. After carrying out their gruesome plan, Maria and Mariana placed Diogo's body in several trash bags and stored them in the trunk of their car. In a disturbing twist, security cameras later captured the two women embracing and laughing as they visited a nearby shopping mall ATM to withdraw money using Diogo's account. Returning home, they began the grotesque task of dismembering his body. Diogo's torso was eventually placed in a black plastic bag, while other parts were disposed of in separate containers. All this took place at Mariana's parents' home, unbeknownst to her family. Meanwhile, Diogo's friends grew increasingly concerned over his sudden disappearance. They launched a missing persons campaign and contacted authorities. As protocol required, police waited the mandatory 48 hours before officially launching an investigation by then. Maria and Mariana had already moved forward with the next phase of their plan. Maria took Diogo's car and drove toward the cliffs near the Cabo de São Vicente lighthouse, while Mariana followed in her own vehicle around 2 p.m. Mariana hurled Diogo's torso from the cliff and then left his vehicle nearby to stage a fake suicide. But their plan quickly unraveled. Diogo's remains didn't fall into the sea as they'd expected. Instead, his torso became lodged on the rocks below. The pair then drove about 7 kilometers to the Pago do Inferno waterfall in Tavira, where they disposed of Diogo's remaining body parts in the water. Not long afterward, Diogo's abandoned car was discovered in the parking lot near the lighthouse. Inside, investigators found 2 laptops. Forensic teams launched a comprehensive search of the area by land and sea. Their efforts led to the grim discovery of Diogo's torso, partially wrapped in a black garbage bag, at another coastal location. A French couple made a horrifying find: Diogo's severed head. His hands and feet were also later recovered. What confounded detectives most was how someone like Diogo, gentle, responsible, and hardworking, could become the target of such a heinous act. But as they delved deeper, it became evident Diogo had received 70,000 euros in compensation for his mother's tragic death, and that money had become a deadly motive. Investigators traced a series of suspicious bank transfers from Diogo's account directly to Maria's. When questioned, Maria initially tried to manipulate the narrative, telling police she killed Diogo because he attempted to abuse her. She even claimed this was the real reason she had left her hotel job, but her story didn't hold up. Text messages between her and Diogo revealed a warm and increasingly close relationship after she quit work. During her first police interview, Maria claimed full responsibility, insisting Mariana had no part in the crime. However, Mariana told a different story. She admitted Maria had shared a plan with her, not just to rob Diogo, but to kill him as well. According to Mariana, Maria wanted to inflict enough suffering to force him to give up his banking credentials. Physical evidence was damning. Investigators had text records, access to Diogo's phone, and surveillance footage from the ATM. Both women were arrested on April 1, 2020. They appeared in court that June. Maria continued to insist she acted alone, claiming Diogo's body had remained in a parked car for 2 days before being dismembered, while Mariana's family slept as the trial unfolded. The court fixated on a disturbing detail. The dismemberment had been carried out with surgical precision, clean cuts at the joints, suggesting medical knowledge. Suspicion turned to Mariana, a trained nurse, when asked directly about her involvement. She claimed people simply assumed she had dismembered the body because of her profession. She suggested investigators check online forums or anatomy sites to clarify how it might have been done, given the premeditated, brutal, and calculated nature of the crime. Both women were convicted and sentenced to prison in February 24, 2021. The trial resumed 2 days later. During her testimony, Maria altered her account. She claimed that her original motive was revenge for an alleged attempted assault by Diogo, not money. She insisted she never meant to kill him, only to humiliate him. Maria also stated that Mariana had no personal relationship with Diogo and was unaware of the alleged abuse. The 2 women sat side by side in court but never looked at each other. It's believed they had severed ties after their arrests and subsequent imprisonment. The courtroom proceedings revealed chilling new insights into the murder of Diogo Gonçalves. Several witnesses testified during the trial, including forensic expert Teresa Costa, who focused on the traces of dipam, a powerful sedative found in Diogo's bloodstream. According to Costa, the amount present was significantly lower than what would be expected if Diogo had consumed 3 full ampules. As claimed by the suspects, this discrepancy suggested one of 2 possibilities. Either Diogo never took the full dose, or the substance had been administered many hours before his death, reducing its potency by the time of the autopsy on April 27, 2021. The court delivered its verdict. Maria was found guilty of aggravated murder, accessory to desecration of a body, robbery, unlawful access, and fraud. She was also convicted of carjacking and possession of an illegal weapon. The court sentenced her to 25 years in prison and ordered her to pay 265,000 euros in compensation to Diogo's father Mariana. On the other hand, was acquitted of murder. However, she was found guilty of desecrating a corpse and complicity in fraud, for which she received a 4-year prison sentence because her charges did not warrant pre-trial detention. Mariana was released immediately after sentencing. The court took particular note of Mariana's attempt to revive Diogo, interpreting it as evidence that she had not intended to kill him. Her confession, where she accepted full responsibility for her actions, so played a role in the court's decision. But outside the courtroom, the reaction was far less forgiving. The Portuguese public was outraged, many believing that Mariana had been just as involved in Diogo's death as Maria. In their eyes, the justice system had failed following the verdict. Mariana quietly exited through a rear door of the courthouse. Her father, who had attended every day of the proceedings, was waiting for her. The two said nothing to the reporters gathered outside it. While that case shocked the public with its cruelty, it was nothing compared to what would be uncovered years earlier. On September 29, 2006, at St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow, United Kingdom. That day, detectives discovered the body of a young woman hidden within the church grounds. What they didn't yet realize was that this murder would lead them directly to one of Britain's most remorseless serial killers. His name was Peter Britton Tobin, born on August 27, 1946, in Johnstone, Scotland. Peter was the youngest of 8 children in the family of Marjorie and Daniel Tobin. From a young age, he was described as troubled and difficult to control. At just 7 years old, he was sent to boarding school in 1953, an attempt by his parents to correct his behavior, but the intervention had little effect. Eventually, Tobin ended up in a juvenile correctional facility, and after completing his sentence, he moved to Brighton, England. There, he began a relationship with Margaret Mount, a 17-year-old typist who was captivated by his charm and confidence. In August 1969, the two were married, but almost immediately, Tobin's mask began to slip. He was cruel, violent, and controlling. On top of the abuse, he became involved in criminal activity. Within a year, he was arrested and sentenced for theft and forgery, and Margaret filed for divorce in 1973. That same year, Tobin married again, this time to Sylvia Jeffrey, a nurse who also fell under his manipulative spell. Peter Tobin had taken Vicky Hamilton's life, either in a twisted act of malice or to silence her forever after the assault. He held on to her belongings, including her purse, as if keeping a trophy. When Vicky failed to arrive home and no one heard from her, her family grew frantic. In desperation, they contacted the police, launching what would become one of Scotland's largest ever missing persons investigations. Vicky's school photo soon became one of the most recognizable images across the country. As the pressure intensified and the case gained public attention, Tobin made a calculated move, relocating to Margate, a coastal town in southeast England. There, he moved into a seemingly idyllic home with a tidy garden, but beneath the surface, horror lay buried. Lidbin transported Vicky's body across the country. He wrapped her remains in plastic, concealed her beneath a concrete slab in the garden, and carefully covered the area with soil. To neighbors, it appeared he was simply building a sandbox for his 3-year-old son. During the early stages of the investigation, Peter Tobin's name never came up. He was just a ghost, a predator, operating in plain sight. Police, desperate for leads, eventually found Vicky's purse on February 21, 1991, near a bus station in Edinburgh. It seemed to confirm their growing theory that Vicky, struggling with her parents' divorce, had likely run away. What they didn't realize was that the purse had been planted by Tobin himself, a cold manipulation to throw investigators off his trail. It worked. Detectives spent months chasing false leads in London. Meanwhile, Vicky's family spiraled. Her mother passed away, never learning what had really happened to her daughter. Over the next decade, the case remained open, but stagnant. Investigators compiled over 7,000 names, took nearly 4,000 witness statements, logged 500 case documents, and reviewed 380 physical exhibits. Yet they had nothing. The case was eventually shelved, but Peter Tobin wasn't finished. The next young woman to cross paths with him was Dinah McNichol, an 18-year-old from Essex, raised in a lively household with one brother and 3 sisters. Dinah's early life had already been marked by tragedy. Her mother had died in a car crash years earlier, leaving her father to raise the children on his own. Despite this, Dinah was warm-hearted, bright, and full of ambition. She had just finished school and was torn between taking a gap year to travel or going straight to university, though she hadn't yet received her acceptance letters. Her future brimmed with possibility. In August 1991, Dinah attended a music festival in Hampshire. It was there she met David Tremlett, a fellow teenager. The two hit it off quickly. They danced, laughed, and even spent the final night together in a tent. On Monday, August 5th, they began their journey home hitchhiking, which was common at the time, as fate would have it. Peter Tobin pulled up and offered them a lift. David got out first, and Dinah jotted down his phone number before saying goodbye. In the car, she had no idea what awaited her. That same day, Peter Tobin raped and murdered Dinah, just as he had done with Vicky. He used her scarf as a gag, a cruel and personal detail that investigators would only understand years later. After the killing, he accessed Dinah's bank account and began withdrawing money from ATMs across Hampshire and Sussex. When her family noticed the suspicious withdrawals, alarm bells rang. Dinah was known to be incredibly frugal, carefully saving her money for her future travels or education. The sudden activity didn't make sense. As the days turned into weeks, silence became unbearable. Though no one voiced it aloud, everyone feared the worst. Dinah would never come home as scrutiny around him grew. Peter Tobin vanished from Margate without explanation. By 1993, he had reappeared in Hampshire, living in a modest apartment in Lee Park, claiming he wanted to be closer to his son. In August 4th, 1993, exactly 2 years after Dinah vanished, 2 14-year-old girls visited a local woman who wasn't home, hoping for help. They knocked on a neighbor's door. It was Peter Tobin who answered. Accounts differ on how the encounter unfolded. One version claims the visit was innocent. The girls were simply looking for someone. Another suggests they responded to a babysitting ad Peter had placed. Regardless, they entered his home, reassured by the presence of Tobin's young son, who seemed friendly once inside. The nightmare began. After the boy fell asleep, Peter turned. He tied up the girls, threatened them with a knife, and forced them to drink alcohol. Then came the assault. He beat and raped them, inflicting serious injuries on one of the girls, just when it seemed like their lives might end there. A stroke of luck intervened. Tobin's son woke up. The distraction broke the spell long enough for the girls to escape and run for their lives, alerting the police immediately. That call would prove to be the beginning of the end for Peter Tobin, suffering the same horrifying fate that had already befallen Vicky Hamilton and Dinah McNichol, in a final attempt to prevent his young son from realizing the horrors that had taken place, or perhaps understanding the monster his father truly was. Peter left the apartment with the child. According to some reports, he departed around 2:00 a.m., but not before making one last attempt at murder. Before walking out, Peter turned on the gas in the kitchen, intending to kill the girls through asphyxiation, but they survived miraculously. The girls regained consciousness, disoriented, but driven by instinct. They escaped the apartment and ran for help. When they reached police, they reported everything: the physical abuse, the threats, the rape. They described Peter in vivid detail, knowing the authorities would soon catch up to him. Peter returned his son to the child's mother and disappeared, only to reappear under a new identity. He joined a religious sect known as the Communion of Jesus, adopting a false name and hoping to blend into their ranks unnoticed, but the damage had already been done. Police had released Peter's photo to the media, and his face became one of the most recognizable in the country. Public appeals, especially through the BBC's Crime Watch, brought in a flood of information. One key detail stood out: his vehicle had been spotted after 40 days on the run. Peter was finally located and arrested in Brighton on May 18, 1994. Peter appeared in court. He pleaded guilty to multiple charges of sexual assault and indecent acts against the two young girls. The court sentenced him to 14 years in prison, but, troublingly, he did not serve the full term. Peter was released in 2014 at the age of 58. After his release, Peter returned to Scotland. Though he was required to register as a sex offender, he sought ways to slip under the radar, using yet another false identity. This time as Peter McLaughlin, he posed as a homeless man and knocked on the door of St. Patrick's Church in Glasgow. Dennis and Katie Crichton, a married couple involved in the church's charitable outreach, remembered the night. Clearly a ragged man, claiming to be down on his luck, had asked for shelter despite his disheveled appearance. Katie felt uneasy about him, but said nothing at the time. Peter, raised Catholic, knew how to move within the church without raising suspicions. He played the role of a humble beggar, his presence arousing only sympathy. Slowly, he ingratiated himself with the community. Over the next several weeks, he helped with repairs and maintenance. Eventually, he even asked the priest if he could join the church staff. Around that same time, a young woman named Angelica Cluck entered Peter's orbit. Angelica was a 23-year-old student from Poland who had come to Scotland during her summer break in 2006. She worked as a cleaner and lived in the parish house at St. Patrick's. She had dreams of improving her English and funding her education back home. She was warm, diligent, and trusting. Peter immediately took a liking to her. Gradually, he convinced her to assist him with odd jobs around the church. On Sunday, September 24th, Angelica spent several hours helping him paint a shed on the church grounds. Parishioners saw them together that day. That afternoon, something terrible happened. Angelica and Andrew Brown, who lived in a building overlooking the church, later told police they heard a chilling scream through their open window. Leica described it as short but deeply unsettling, like someone being physically restrained. She looked out but saw nothing. That scream, it would later be discovered, came at the moment Peter attacked Angelica from behind. He struck her and dragged her to a secluded area behind the chapel. There, he beat her, raped her, and stabbed her multiple times. When she lost consciousness, he hid her wounded but still living body beneath the chapel floor just feet from the confessional booth. As hours passed, members of the parish began to worry. Angelica was known for her punctuality. She would never vanish without a word. Dennis eventually mentioned her disappearance to Katie, who also felt something was terribly wrong. The police were called in. They quickly began interviewing those at the church. Didn't take long for Peter to become a person of interest, though he was operating under the alias Pete, the homeless handyman. Several witnesses confirmed he was the last person seen with Angelica. Officers attempted to locate and question him, but Peter had already fled, this time to London. By now, Detective David Swindell had joined the case. His instincts told him this was not a missing persons case. It was far worse, based on testimonies and Peter's disturbing history. Swindell feared Angelica had already been killed on September 29, 2006. The police made a horrifying discovery. Angelica's body was found hidden beneath the church floor. The crime sent shockwaves across the United Kingdom, not only for the sheer brutality of the murder, but also for the symbolic weight of the location. A sacred place of sanctuary had been desecrated by a man who used religion as his final disguise. What followed was a reckoning of faith, of trust, and of justice. The injuries inflicted on Angelica Cluck led Detective David Swindell to a chilling realization. This was likely not Peter's first crime. The level of violence and control suggested experience, perhaps even a pattern. But what the investigation would soon reveal was far more horrific than anyone imagined. Forensic teams collected DNA samples from the crime scene and from Angelica's body. When those samples were run through the United Kingdom's National Criminal Intelligence Database, The results were immediate and damning. The man they were looking for wasn't just a violent offender. He was already known to law enforcement. His name was Peter Tobin. Fingerprints recovered from the scene matched Tobin's exactly, confirming the connection. As soon as authorities realized who they were dealing with, they moved quickly. His photo was released to the public, and the Scottish police contacted the Metropolitan Police, initiating a nationwide manhunt. But Peter was already several steps ahead in London. He tried to vanish in plain sight by checking himself into a hospital, pretending to suffer from chest pain and numbness on his left side. He gave the alias James Kelly and claimed to be a plumber. It was a calculated move. He hoped the medical system would offer him cover from law enforcement. However, his behavior quickly raised suspicions. Nick Lasso, who examined him, noted that Peter avoided eye contact, appeared overly guarded, and showed no clear signs of cardiac distress. The situation grew more alarming when a nurse on duty recognized Peter from his photograph. His face had been plastered all over the news. The nurse immediately alerted Dr. Lasso, and together they contacted the police. That phone call would change everything. On September 30th, 2006, police officer Alan Murray was dispatched to the hospital. Peter was brought into a private room under the guise of continued medical evaluation. There, Officer Murray confronted him and Peter Tobin was placed under arrest. Initially, he was only charged with breaching the sex offender registry, a strategic move. Authorities needed time to build the full case, and charging him under this violation ensured he could not flee again. With Detective David Swindell now leading the case, the evidence began to pile up. Every forensic detail, every witness statement, and Peter's own inconsistencies painted a damning portrait. In late March 2007, Peter Tobin stood trial for the murder and rape of Angelica Cluck. Despite overwhelming evidence, Tobin denied the charges. He claimed that he and Angelica had engaged in consensual sex. He also denied providing false information to police and hospital staff. For 6 weeks, the court endured a parade of lies, contradictions, and manipulative behavior from Tobin. But in the end, the truth broke through. The jury found Peter Tobin guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, with a minimum term of 21 years before being eligible for parole. Detective Swindell, however, believed the case was far from over. Tobin's crimes against Angelica, while horrifying, were likely only the tip of the iceberg. Detective David Swindell and his team were convinced that the story didn't end with Angelica Cluck. As the trial against Peter Tobin progressed, law enforcement quietly began looking deeper into his past. They launched a confidential investigation, carefully coordinated so as not to jeopardize the ongoing legal proceedings. This multi-agency operation became known as Operation Annabelle. Goal was chilling in its simplicity: identify every place Tobin had lived or visited, and cross-reference it with missing persons cases across the UK. The first breakthrough came with 2 locations, Bathgate and Margate. These towns, both connected to Peter Tobin at various points in his life, would soon reveal a nightmare. In Margate, investigators searched one of Tobin's former homes along the coast. Inside the attic, they discovered a knife, its blade still bearing traces of DNA. But that was just the beginning. They then turned their attention to the backyard, where Tobin had once built a sandbox for his young son. Beneath that sandbox, police made a horrifying discovery: the decomposed body of a woman and then a second body nearby. They also found a handbag buried alongside the remains. It was carefully preserved and sent for forensic analysis. Forensic teams worked tirelessly to identify the 2 women. They tested genetic material found on the handbag and the bodies, but initially, no matches came up in the national DNA database. Then, on June 1st, 2007, a major breakthrough: the DNA evidence matched Peter Tobin's fingerprints, definitively linking him to the remains. Investigators pushed forward with even greater urgency. By August 14, 2007, one of the victims was positively identified: Vicky Hamilton, a 15-year-old girl who had vanished during her first trip away from home. An attempt at early independence. Her family had been waiting for answers for 16 years. Shortly afterward, The second victim was identified as Dinah McNichol, an 18-year-old who had disappeared while hitchhiking home from a music festival on September 1, 2008. The Crown Prosecution Service formally charged Peter Tobin with Vicky's murder when Vicky's father, Michael, saw Tobin in court for the first time. He had to be physically restrained by officers later. He admitted he didn't want to hurt Tobin, he just wanted Tobin to see him, to know he was there to defend his daughter's memory. After a month-long trial, on December 2, 2008, Peter Tobin was found guilty of Vicky Hamilton's murder. He received another life sentence. Trial for Dinah McNichol's murder took place a year later, in December 2009 once again. The evidence was overwhelming. The defense failed to produce any credible alternative explanation. On December 6, Tobin was found guilty of Dinah's murder and sentenced to a third life term, just before his trial for Dinah's case. On November 22, 2007, Peter Tobin was attacked in prison by fellow inmates, though he sustained only minor injuries. The event signaled how hated he had become. Even among other criminals, what shocked authorities even more was a confession Tobin reportedly made around that time. He claimed to have killed 11 people. But no one knew if that was the truth, or another manipulation years later. On October 8, 2022, Peter Tobin died in a hospital. He had taken his secrets to the grave on May 25, 2009. Across the Atlantic, in Portland, Maine, an emergency call was placed to report a fire. First responders arrived to find flames engulfing a small apartment once. The fire was extinguished. Firefighters stepped into a chilling scene. The room was filled with religious symbols, crosses on every wall, candles, and crucifixes lining the floor. In the center of the room lay a charred body, but the most horrifying discovery: the head was missing. The victim was soon identified as Zoe Saraki, a vibrant and artistic young woman who had only just turned 18. Zoe was born on March 25, 1991, in Portland, Maine, the youngest child of John and Linda Saraki. She had an older brother, Gregory, and two half-sisters from her father's previous relationship. Her father worked as a builder, and the family was close-knit and financially stable from a young age. Zoe was drawn to the arts. She loved animals, kept 5 cats, and expressed deep compassion for all living things. Her personality was described as joyful, curious, and deeply empathetic. As she grew older, Zoe became more independent. She adopted a vegan lifestyle, embracing values of animal rights, environmental protection, and holistic health. Her worldview expanded. She was eager to travel, learn new cultures, and discover herself beyond the borders of her hometown. In 2005, Zoe began high school, where she was well-liked and socially active, but in 2008, on her 17th birthday, she shocked her family. Zoe dropped out of school. Her principal, Ken Coonan, recalled that she wouldn't explain her decision. Still, she remained friendly and respectful, and her classmates continued to speak highly of her. Ken remembered her as a free-spirit, creative, and deeply engaged with other like-minded young people. Soon after leaving school, Zoe began working at a local bakery and coffee shop called Bagel Works. It was a small, tight-knit environment where she felt safe and appreciated. On March 25, 2009, Zoe turned 18 and was excited to finally get a tattoo. She had long admired the work of Austrian artist Gustav Klimt, and she chose one of his iconic designs for her tattoo. She saw it as a symbol of adulthood, her first act as a fully independent woman. She had no idea that the decision to mark her body with art would coincide with the final days of her life. Zoe Saraki had no idea that a simple tattoo appointment would introduce her to someone who would irrevocably change the course of her life. On her 18th birthday, March 25, 2009, Zoe visited a tattoo parlor in Portland's Old Port area. She knew exactly what she wanted: a piece inspired by the artwork of Austrian painter Gustav Klimt. That's where she met Chad Gurney, a 27-year-old tattoo artist. Their connection was immediate, and within days, Zoe agreed to be his girlfriend. The 9-year age gap didn't faze her. Chad was an unconventional figure raised in Wells, Maine. He once made a name for himself as a lacrosse goalie in high school, Later, he attended Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia, school closely associated with famed evangelist Pastor Jerry Falwell. Chad's body was covered in tattoos, many depicting aliens, symbolizing either a belief in the otherworldly or a deep sense of personal alienation. One striking piece of gray-toned crocodile suggested danger and aggression beyond tattoos. Chad immersed himself in hardcore dance, a physical, intense, and often aggressive form of self-expression that requires full body control, not but rather an explosive release of emotion. His body also bore the scars of a devastating car accident in Alabama. The Liberty University lacrosse team's van was rear-ended and thrown into oncoming traffic, colliding with a truck. Chad was ejected from the vehicle. He nearly lost his leg and endured around 20 surgeries. The head trauma he sustained led to cognitive impairments affecting his memory, speech, and reasoning. He later won a 7-figure settlement from a lawsuit in 2007. Chad began receiving treatment for anxiety and depression. He was ultimately diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, and an organic personality disorder by 2009. His passion for travel had taken him to Hawaii, and later to Portland, Maine, where he met Zoe. Their relationship was anything but conventional. They agreed to keep things open, allowing each other to see other people. In May 2009, Chad traveled to Vancouver for the weekend. When he returned, Zoe admitted that she had been intimate with another man during his absence. While their arrangement permitted this, something shifted in Chad. He began insisting that Zoe quit her job and accompany him on a spiritual journey to Thailand. She declined. She had no idea how dark things were about to turn. On May 25, 2009, Zoe visited Chad's apartment. She was exhausted and decided to take a nap while she slept. Chad attacked. He strangled her, struck her head, and didn't stop until she was lifeless. Then, in a horrifying escalation, he sexually assaulted her body and decapitated her. After the murder, Chad showered, changed his clothes, and drove to a gas station. He filled a canister with gasoline, returned to the apartment, and drenched Zoe's body and the surrounding area. He laid a trail of fuel from the lower floor to the front door and set the place ablaze with his bag already packed for Thailand. Chad took his laptop, a shotgun, and left. He withdrew cash from an ATM and checked into a motel in Old Orchard Beach. There, he soaked in a jacuzzi as if nothing had happened. Meanwhile, emergency services responded to a 911 call, reporting the fire once extinguished. Firefighters made a gruesome discovery: a charred, headless body surrounded by religious symbols and crosses. The horror of the scene was indescribable. A neighbor, unaware of the events, called Chad to inform him that his apartment had burned down. He lied, saying he wasn't in town. He was visiting his hometown of Lewiston, then abruptly hung up the following day. May 26th, Chad called his best friend, calm and composed. He confessed to everything he said. He was tired of the pain and couldn't control himself anymore. As he talked on the phone, he drove through Portland's streets, still processing what he had done. But soon, he ran a red light, drawing the attention of a nearby police officer. The officer pulled Chad over for running a red light. As the officer approached, Chad, distressed but strangely composed, asked his friend, still on the phone, to explain his situation. He insisted the officer hear about the car accident he had suffered in 2005, claiming it had impacted his mental health. Shortly after this encounter, Chad made a decision that stunned everyone. He walked into the Portland Police Department and calmly confessed to murdering Zoe Sirakopoulos, seized his belongings, including his laptop. A computer crimes investigator uncovered a chilling piece of evidence on the hard drive, a video file labeled, "Woman half decapitated for suspected infidelity. At least if she cheated, she won't do it again." That video was later submitted into evidence during Chad's trial the next day, Wednesday, May 27th, at the high school Zoe had attended. Students and staff observed a solemn moment of silence in her memory during lunch. A room was set aside for grief counseling, where social workers and mental health professionals supported the devastated student body. Zoe's stepsister, Christine, Koo was the first family member to speak publicly. She told reporters this wasn't just a murder, it was the result of deeply evil actions. According to Christine, detectives revealed the full extent of the horror that Chad had attacked Zoe in a fit of rage, violated her body after death, set her remains on fire, and then, with chilling calm, checked into a motel and slipped into a jacuzzi as though nothing had happened on June 2nd. 1 week after the murder, a candlelight vigil was held in front of Chad's former apartment building. Over 150 people gathered, friends, classmates, strangers united in sorrow, prayer, and disbelief. Candles flickered beside flowers placed on the steps where Zoe's life had been stolen. Her father, J.N. Saraki, and stepsister Courtney attended the vigil, moved by the outpouring of love and support from the community. Meanwhile, the investigation intensified. Police began interviewing Chad's friends, colleagues, and acquaintances, piecing together a complex and conflicting portrait. Some described him as a spiritual seeker. His apartment was filled with religious imagery, and he often spoke of traveling to Thailand to study Eastern philosophy. He could be soft-spoken and generous, giving away small gifts and expressing a desire to use the money from his accident settlement for humanitarian causes. But others saw a different side of Chad. He cultivated a tough exterior, flaunting his tattoo-covered arms and adopting provocative confrontational behavior. According to one acquaintance, Robert Collins, Chad often made people uncomfortable at parties. Robert once confided in Chad during a late-night phone call, and Chad told him the only thing he truly identified with was pain. That word, Robert recalled, was even tattooed across Chad's knuckles. Detectives also spoke to Steve Weir, who had rented an apartment from Chad back in 2006. Steve remembered Chad's fascination with religious symbols and theology, but noted that he didn't actually practice any faith. Another tattoo parlor owner, Watson Atkinson, revealed that Chad once said he wanted to use his settlement money to find himself. But Watson also recalled something far more disturbing: Chad's unusual interest in teenage girls. So concerned was Watson that he forbade his own 16-year-old daughter from speaking with Chad. As the case moved forward, investigators dug into Chad's medical and psychiatric history. While it was true that Chad had been diagnosed with PTSD and an organic personality disorder after his accident, new psychological evaluations conducted in custody painted a different picture. 3 separate psychologists interviewed Chad. None found signs of delusion or hallucinations. Chad spoke lucidly about his feelings of betrayal after Zoe admitted to sleeping with another man. He admitted he had grown weary of being cheated on in past relationships. Zoe's honesty, instead of earning his respect, appeared to break something inside him. In a chilling confession, Chad told the psychologists that after he had killed Zoe, he committed a sexual act with her remains. He explained that he did this because he had already crossed a terrible line and began contemplating what the worst thing he could possibly do next would be. When Chad's trial began, the prosecution released a 127-minute video of his police interrogation, recorded nearly 12 hours after the murdering. The footage, Chad sat across from Detective Danham. He remained composed but emotional, crying at times and repeatedly apologizing. He described his relationship with Zoe as loving and open, saying they got along well and that she sometimes stayed at his apartment for up to a week. He claimed they were soulmates and that Zoe had always tried to be honest with him. "I took the life," he said, "of the most beautiful girl I ever knew." He insisted that the least he could do now was tell the truth. Chad then began recounting, in detail, what happened on May 25, 2009. According to him, Zoe was asleep when it all began. As the interrogation continued, Chad described the moment he approached Zoe as she slept and began to strangle her. She woke up and fought back, screaming, pleading for him to stop, but Chad didn't. He told detectives that when she resisted, he struck her on the head, then kept strangling her until she stopped breathing. What followed was a chilling confession. Chad detailed the horrific acts he committed on Zoe's body after her death, He clarified that contrary to earlier reports, he did not use a samurai sword but instead 3 kitchen knives to decapitate her. He'd placed a cross between her legs and spoke about what he did as her body burned in the apartment throughout the interrogation. He repeatedly called himself a terrible person when detectives asked why he decapitated Zoe. Chad gave a disturbing answer. He claimed he was attempting to turn her death into a ritual of forgiveness, pressed further for a motive. Chad struggled to explain. He eventually said he felt possessed, as if everything in his life went dark that day. He described those hours as a time when he lost all sense of himself, becoming, in his words, a wild, primitive beast, driven by basic instincts. That monstrous state, he said, was why he carried out such an atrocity. This 5-hour police interrogation was later submitted as critical evidence in Cumberland County Supreme Court during pre-trial hearings. The prosecution played the full recording for Judge Rowland. Cold prosecutors noted that Chad faced a minimum of 25 years and a maximum of life in prison in a 2011 hearing. It was proposed that if his mental illness was acknowledged, he could potentially be transferred to a psychiatric facility in Austria. While it was clear that Zoe had been strangled in a fit of rage, questions lingered over whether Chad truly grasped the reality of what he had done. Chad had waived his right to a jury trial. Prosecutors argued that he was fully aware of his actions, that this wasn't an impulsive psychotic break, but a calculated and sadistic killing. A psychiatrist and psychologists were called to testify. Their evaluations aligned. Chad was not delusional. He understood the nature and consequences of what he did. The defense leaned heavily on Chad's history of mental health issues, especially following a traumatic 2005 accident. They argued that he was tormented by shame, fear, and a growing sense of losing control. Chad's attorney, Sarah Churchill, later attempted to have evidence thrown out, particularly a graphic video discovered on his computer. In it, Chad chillingly explained how to decapitate a woman who had been unfaithful. Churchill argued that the video should not have been admissible. But in March 2012, nearly 3 years after Zoe Saraki's murder, 30-year-old Chad Gurney was sentenced to 50 years in prison for murder and an additional 25 years for arson. The sentences were to run consecutively. His legal team appealed the ruling, but the appeal was denied. Zoe's family had hoped for a life sentence. During sentencing, the judge acknowledged that Chad did not perceive reality the way most people did, but that wasn't the issue. The issue was whether Chad knew what he was doing and whether he understood it was wrong. The court concluded that he did. Sarah Churchill argued before the Supreme Court that the brain injuries Chad suffered in 2005 left him in a persistent state of delusion. She claimed the trial judge had erred in admitting evidence from Chad's smartphone, laptop, and social media, insisting that more weight should have been given to evidence of psychosis and mental deterioration. The Deputy Attorney General pushed back, stating that the crime was a calculated act of revenge against Zoe for her betrayal Chad could not tolerate. He emphasized that none of the social media data had been used against Chad. The case, he said, stood on its own horrific merit. There was overwhelming evidence that Chad knew exactly what he was doing. After the sentencing, Zoe's aunt, Kathy Kosov, spoke to reporters. She said she felt breathless listening to Chad speak, haunted by the thought of her niece's final, agonizing moments. Sonny Teon and Michael Palin's paths first crossed in Portland, Maine, where Michael's Navy ship the Brandby was briefly docked. Their meeting took place along the waterfront, and from the start, Michael was captivated by Annie. At the time, he was living in Charleston, South Carolina, where he was highly regarded in the Navy as a computer systems operator. His military record was decorated with awards, and he had participated in several key operations. Annie, already struggling as a single mother of 3 young children, was drawn to Michael's discipline, his status, and the sense of stability he seemed to offer. She told a friend she believed she had finally found someone worthy of her love. Over the next few months, their relationship deepened. Eventually, Annie and Michael made the decision to live together and create a family with her 2 sons, Jimmy and Sean, and her baby daughter, Shane. But their new beginning was shattered by tragedy. One day, A fire broke out in their apartment. Annie wasn't home at the time. Annie, Michael, and the children were inside. Michael managed to escape the flames with the two boys, but Shane, still an infant, couldn't make it out when Annie returned and saw the blaze. She tried to rush inside to save her daughter, but neighbors restrained her. The fire took Shane's life. It left Annie utterly broken. She later said that losing Shane had created a permanent, irreplaceable void in her heart. Investigators launched a probe into the blaze, but fire experts struggled to determine what had caused it. The circumstances were suspicious, deeply soaked. Ultimately, the case was closed without any charges filed after the fire. Annie moved back in with her mother in Portland. Michael, meanwhile, threw himself into his Navy work and relocated to the barracks. But then, another troubling event occurred, this time even closer to home. Just months later, a shed in the backyard of Annie's mother's house caught fire. Investigators acted quickly and discovered a lighter at the sin engraved with the word Branby, the name of Michael's ship. The evidence raised immediate red flags, placing Michael as a potential suspect. But once again, there wasn't enough proof to formally charge him following the second suspicious fire. Maine child welfare authorities became concerned for the safety of Annie's sons, convinced that Jimmy and Sean were living in a potentially dangerous environment. The state removed them from Annie's custody and placed them in foster care. The decision devastated her. She fought hard to get her sons back, but despite her best efforts, she never did. Already mourning one child, Annie was now separated from Tumorin. The months that followed, Michael returned to Charleston. He rented an apartment and, once again, reconnected with Annie. Despite all that had happened between them, Annie agreed to speak with him eventually. She moved to Goose Creek, a quiet suburb outside Charleston, to live with Michael again. But soon, the cracks in their fragile reunion began to show. Annie discovered a photograph of Michael wearing a wedding ring when she confronted him. He admitted the truth. He had been married before his ex-wife, Dawn Breeze, and their 3 children were still living in his mother's home in Savannah, Georgia. Michael insisted that the marriage was long over and that he had no ongoing ties to Dawn. Though shaken, Annie chose to stay. She still clung to the hope that Michael could offer the family life she longed for. That hope quickly faded. Michael's behavior became increasingly volatile, cruel, demeaning, and controlling. Just as Annie began to make plans to return home to her mother's, she discovered she was pregnant. The news changed everything. In October 1989, just 1 month before she would disappear, Annie gave birth to her 4th child, a daughter named Jade. Though Annie knew no child could replace Shane, she felt that Jade had brought light back into her life. But the joy was short-lived. McKeel's treatment of Annie worsened in the weeks following Jade's birth. He mocked her, insulted her, and tried to control every aspect of her life. He began locking her in the apartment during his work hours, disconnecting the phone and keeping it in his briefcase to isolate her. Annie's fear of him grew rapidly. 2 days before her disappearance, Annie made a desperate phone call to her best friend, Katie French, in a trembling voice. She confided that she had told Michael she planned to leave him, and that his chilling response was that if she left, their daughter Jade would stay with him. Annie was terrified, in tears. She begged Katie to come get her and the baby, but Katie was tied up with her own obligations and couldn't get there. Instead, she wired Annie money for a bus ticket, hoping it would be enough to help her escape before it was too late. The money Katie French sent was meant to give Annie a way out to help her escape with baby Jade and return home to Portland, but neither of them knew that their last phone call would also be their final goodbye. 2 days later, on November 7th, 1989, Katie tried to reach Annie again, but there was no answer. Days went by in silence. Then, Michael Palin called Katie with unsettling news. He claimed that on November 6th, Annie had packed her belongings and left, vanishing without a word. Headed in an unknown direction, Katie, still hopeful, believed Annie would contact her once she had settled somewhere new. But Thanksgiving came and went, and by November 24th, Annie had been missing for nearly 3 weeks. Desperate and growing increasingly alarmed, Katie began reaching out to Annie's friends and acquaintances. None of them had heard from her. Katie then tried to report Annie is missing, but was told she couldn't file a report because she wasn't a blood relative. Weeks turned to months. Eventually, in her determined search, Katie got the phone number from Michael Palin's mother. What she learned shook her to the core. Baby Jade was in the woman's care. Katie was devastated. Annie would never have willingly left her infant daughter behind. Something was terribly wrong. But despite this red flag, Michael Palin showed little concern over Annie's disappearance. He made no public appeals, didn't assist police, and never launched a search soon after. He received a transfer to the Pearl Harbor Naval Base in Hawaii, leaving Annie's disappearance behind, as though she had never existed. Wasn't until Annie's mother officially filed a report that law enforcement finally opened a formal missing persons investigation. All attention quickly turned to Michael Palin, Honey's live-in partner, and the last known person to see her alive. Michael's account was troubling. He told investigators that on the morning of November 6, 1989, he awoke to find Annie gone, her infant daughter left behind. He claimed the night before, Annie had expressed a desire to end their relationship. According to him, he assumed the breakup was final and felt no need to pursue further communication. He also insisted he had no idea Annie hadn't contacted her family, or that she had even been reported missing. When police searched the apartment the couple had shared, they found no evidence, no signs of a struggle, no belongings left behind, nothing that could provide a lead. Annie Taeyeon had vanished without a trace, and with no physical evidence, no major search was ever launched. Her case quickly went cold for long years. Annie's fate remained a mystery. No sightings, no calls, no clues. But Katie French refused to give up while others moved on. She became Annie's sole voice, dedicating herself to the search. She racked up over $16,000 in phone bills, hired a private investigator, and contacted every agency that might uncover more about Michael Palin's past. Katie believed, without a doubt, that Michael was dangerous. She also feared him, worried that if he ever discovered her role in the investigation, he might come after her too. Then, in 1993, a major breakthrough came. Annie Taeyeon's case was officially transferred to the Naval Criminal Investigative Service (NCIS). The agency launched a full reinvestigation. Starting from scratch, agents tracked Michael Palin to the Pearl Harbor base and requested an interview, but Michael was evasive. He would only speak if his attorney was present, and soon after that, he stopped cooperating altogether. Agents gathered every shred of information they could and reached out to South Carolina authorities. They asked one critical question: were there any unidentified female victims discovered around November 1989, especially any who had recently given birth? The answer changed everything. South Carolina police had a case that matched: a woman's body found beside a highway in Jasper County, just 100 miles from where Annie had lived with Michael. The woman had given birth 1 month before her murder. Police provided a facial sketch of the victim, and NCIS agents were stunned. The resemblance was uncanny. They were certain they had found Annie. The crime scene was horrific. Annie's body had been stuffed into a military-issued duffel bag, soaked in gasoline, and set on fire. The bag had been discovered at 6:00 a.m. on November 7, 1989, the very day Katie French's calls to Annie had suddenly gone unanswered. The brutality was staggering. Annie's skull had been shattered into 124 pieces. It took forensic specialists nearly 500 painstaking hours to reconstruct her face for identification. Dental records confirmed it. The murdered woman was 24-year-old Annie Taeyeon, with her body identified. Michael Palin was immediately named the prime suspect in her murder. He had motive, he had opportunity, and now, investigators had a timeline that aligned too perfectly to ignore. What came next would be a years-long effort to hold Michael accountable. The reinvigorated investigation into Annie Taeyeon's murder began with a close look at Michael Palin's movements and finances on the day she disappeared. Investigators quickly found something troubling: a credit card transaction made by Michael approximately 25 miles south of where Annie's charred remains had been found digging deeper. They reviewed his phone records on November 6, 1989, the day Annie vanished. Michael made 2 early morning calls to his mother's house in Savannah, one call at 4:35 a.m. and another at 5:17 a.m. This timeline began to shape up. Chilling theory agents suspected that Michael had murdered Annie in their apartment, then transported her body to a remote roadside location there. He had attempted to destroy the evidence, soaking her in gasoline and setting her remains on fire before returning home to learn more. NCIS investigators turned their attention to a person who might hold crucial insight: Michael's ex-wife, Dawn Breeze. At the time of Annie's death, Dawn was still legally married to Michael and living at his mother's house in Long after Annie's disappearance, Dawn filed for divorce and began moving frequently, relocating across various states almost as if she were running from something after years of searching. Agents finally located her in the summer of 1995, living in Miami, Florida. By then, Dawn had immersed herself in spiritual practices and was earning a living as a practitioner. Agents met her at her place of work to discuss the case, but her response caught them off guard. Calm and composed, she asked how long the interview would take, curious if she'd still have time to eat. The agents had expected a more emotional reaction, though Dawn appeared detached. Inconsistencies began to surface during what turned into a 10-hour interrogation initially. Her story aligned with Michael's. She claimed Annie had simply left, and that Michael was raising the child alone. But the more she was questioned, the more details didn't add up, especially about when exactly she had visited Michael's apartment. Then came a pause. Dawn looked down, went quiet, and finally said something that shifted the entire case. "I want to tell the truth." Her tone was flat, no tears, no visible remorse, but what she said next was nothing short of horrifying. She told agents that one early morning in November 1989, Michael had frantically summoned her to the Charleston apartment he shared with Annie. When she arrived, she found Annie's lifeless body lying on the living room floor, without emotion. She recounted how Michael asked her to go to the bedroom, where baby Jade was sleeping, despite still being married and raising 3 children with Michael at the time. Dawn listened as he confessed that he had been having an affair with Annie, and that their relationship had led to the birth of a daughter. He then begged Dawn to accept the child and help raise her. According to Dawn, Michael told her he hadn't wanted to fight a custody battle. Instead, he had chosen what he believed was the simpler solution: murder. Dawn described the brutal events that unfolded in the early hours of November 6th. After a moment of intimacy, Annie fell asleep in bed, Jade lying beside her. Then, without warning, Michael retrieved a crowbar and began striking Annie repeatedly in the head. She never stood a chance once she was dead. He called Dawn for help. She arrived to find Michael placing Annie's body in a military-issued naval duffel bag. He loaded the bag into the trunk of his car, alongside a gas can. Then he placed Dawn and baby Jade in the back seat and they drove. It was a 100-mile journey through the quiet darkness of pre-dawn South Carolina. Eventually, they reached a secluded stretch of roadside in Jasper County. Michael dragged the bag from the trunk, poured gasoline over Annie's remains, and set the body ablaze as the fire consumed the evidence. Michael rushed back to the car and drove his wife and daughter to his mother's house in Savannah. Dawn Breeze's confession was the first true break in the case, since Annie's remains had been identified to corroborate her story. Investigators asked Dawn to make a monitored call to Michael. She agreed. During the call, she told Michael that Annie's body had been identified and implied that investigators had found forensic evidence, blood, in their former apartment. She said NCIS suspected them both. Michael didn't deny it. Instead, he replied, "Okay, we need to work together and come up with something." There were no questions, no confusion, no denial. Michael's subdued, cooperative tone suggested full understanding of what she was talking about, without her needing to spell it out. And that, to the agents listening in, confirmed what they had long suspected. Annie Tayon had been murdered inside that apartment. By the end of the conversation, Michael made it clear, without ever explicitly confessing, that he knew exactly what had happened. Now, The case against him was finally beginning to take shape as the investigation intensified. NCA's agents advised Dawn Breeze to be extremely cautious with her phone communications. They assured her that they would work together to manage the dangerous situation, and to protect her identity as a cooperating witness, they took extra precautions, including disguising her before any public appearances. Related to the case, one of those critical moments came when agents brought Dawn back to the crime scene, the apartment where Annie had been murdered. Carefully and methodically, Dawn walked the investigators through the apartment layout, pointing out where Annie's body had been placed and recounting the sequence of events in chilling detail. She guided them to a specific area near the wall, pointing to a baseboard and patch of floor where she remembered a heavy pooling of blood. Dawn said the blood had seeped not only into the carpet but into the concrete foundation beneath. By the time of this visit, Michael had long since moved out, and the landlords had replaced the carpeting multiple times visibly. There were no signs of the violence that once occurred there, but when investigators applied a specialized chemical to the concrete, a large purple stain bloomed beneath the surface, evidence of a protein presence consistent with blood. It aligned perfectly with Dawn's account, yet proving that the substance was definitively blood, and more importantly, Annie's blood, posed a major challenge. The NCIS continued searching for other physical evidence to support Dawn's story. One item Dawn recalled was a television set that had been on a nightstand near the bed where Annie was killed. According to her, during the attack, blood had splattered onto the screen, encasing. Michael had told her it required extensive cleaning, and eventually, he got rid of it. Given Michael's known frugality, agents suspected he hadn't discarded the television, but likely sold it. Felt like chasing a ghost, but they kept looking. Meanwhile, Michael had become increasingly paranoid. He was aware he was being watched, especially after his phone call with Dawn. Surveillance teams noted his growing anxiety. The agents feared that Michael might try to run, intimidate witnesses, or worse, resort to violence. Their concerns weren't unfounded. During one operation, Michael attempted to flee surveillance, but agents acted quickly. On October 11th, 1995, Michael Palin was apprehended and placed in custody at a military prison under suspicion of murder. While Michael awaited formal charges, NCIS agents cast a wider net. They began interviewing every former resident of the apartment complex from back in November 1989. Their diligence paid off 3 months later, when a former neighbor came forward with a surprising claim. He had purchased a television from Michael Palin. More astonishing, the television was still in his possession and fully functional. The NCIS seized it and sent it straight to the FBI for forensic analysis. What they discovered was a breakthrough. Inside the speaker casing, technicians found 11 discrete blood spots. DNA testing confirmed the blood belonged to Annie Tahanet. Was the piece of physical evidence they had long been searching for. At this stage, Michael Palin's defense team approached prosecutors with a proposal. He would plead guilty if the death penalty was taken off the table, though the prosecution was far from satisfied with the terms. Military law permitted such agreements with limited options. The deal was made during trial. Michael delivered his confession, but his delivery was cold, emotionless, and deeply unsettling as he recited the gruesome details of the murder. It sounded less like a confession and more like reading aloud from a shopping list. There was no remorse, no sorrow, just calculated detachment. The end. Michael Palin was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 30 years. He also received a dishonorable discharge from the Navy for Dawn Breeze, despite remaining silent for 6 years. After witnessing the aftermath of the murder, she avoided legal repercussions. Her detailed confession and cooperation had been pivotal in breaking the case open. Nanny Teon's surviving children, including the daughter she had with Michael, were finally told the truth about what had happened. They now understood that their mother had not abandoned them. She had been taken. Jade, the daughter born from Annie and Michael's brief relationship, has grown into adulthood within the Teon family. she has never re-established contact with her father in a shocking twist. Michael Palin was released from prison in 2013 after serving just 17 years credited for good behavior. His current whereabouts are unknown. Authorities advise that if anyone encounters him, they should proceed with extreme caution. Ronald Vinci had spent a lifetime building an Empire One dealership, at a time known for his sharp business acumen and unrelenting drive. He turned a modest motorcycle shop into one of California's largest Honda dealerships. His wealth grew rapidly, and with it came the trappings of a luxurious lifestyle to his employees. Ronald was a commanding figure, resolute, exacting, and unyielding away from the office. However, his personality shifted after a divorce from his first wife, Pamela, with whom he had a son named Carrie. Ronald dove headfirst into a life of indulgence. His interests veered into the extravagant. He began collecting airplanes and helicopters, even building a private hangar to house his growing fleet. His Rancho Santa Fe estate in California was no ordinary residence. Determined to elevate his convenience, Ron petitioned county officials to install a personal helicopter pad on the property, a move that drew sharp objections from neighbors. Still, he prevailed in time. Helipads also adorned the rooftops of his dealerships, giving him the power to commute by air at will. By 1990, 50-year-old Ronald Vinci seemed to have it all. That same year, during a flight, fate intervened aboard. The plane was 34-year-old Catherine Pelly, a flight attendant with Delta Airlines, raised in rural Georgia. Catherine came from a close-knit family. She had charmed her community through beauty pageants in her youth. Known for her grace, charisma, and ever-present smile, after working for years as a lab technician at a veterans hospital, Catherine longed for more. So, in 1980, she left medicine behind and embraced the skies. Her job with Delta paid $20,000 a year. Not glamorous by any means, but she took pride in it. She knew all the tricks of the trade, even using coffee grounds to neutralize odors after drink spills. But it was on one of these flights that she met the millionaire who would change her life. Ronald was instantly captivated by Catherine, despite the 14-year age gap. Their romance took off quickly. Catherine left her flight attendant career behind and moved into Ronald's lavish California estate. They traveled often, spending winters in Aspen and summers in the sun, painting the picture of an ideal life together. But Ronald never proposed after nearly a decade of waiting and a relationship marked by Ronald's drinking, public flirtations, and private insults. Catherine left in April 2001. She moved to Florida to start over. She was 45 years old when she met 63-year-old insurance broker Dilio Corano. Through mutual friends, financially secure and emotionally available, Dilio was everything Ronald had not been. Catherine quickly opened up about her past, describing the Vinci relationship as emotionally exhausting, full of broken promises and humiliation. Within a month of meeting Dilio, he proposed, and this time, Catherine said yes. They married in May 2001, just weeks after their first introduction. At first, their life together in Miami Beach seemed blissful. Dilio described Catherine as gentle and soft-spoken, comparing her to a domestic cat, quiet.com, and barely eating. But he soon discovered troubling undercurrent. Catherine had a deep, irrational fear of water. Even stepping into a river or the ocean caused her visible distress, and she would panic at the thought of full-body immersion. Then came the spending. Catherine began demanding large sums of money, first for clothes, then for gifts, always with vague explanations. She often compared Dilio to her friends' wealthier, more generous husbands. By his estimate, Catherine was withdrawing nearly $55,000 a month, often citing educational expenses, though she never provided any documentation or receipts. Within months, Dilio came to a painful realization. He had rushed into the marriage. Their separation was swift and relatively uncomplicated. They had no children, no shared property. Court records later revealed the vast financial disparity. Dilio was worth $45 million. Catherine had just $88,000 to her name. As she packed her belongings and prepared to leave, Catherine grew despondent in a moment of vulnerability. She reportedly told Dilio, "I don't succeed in anything, there's just no meaning in my life." By 2005, Ronald Vinci had also undergone major life changes. He sold his dealerships and moved to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, drawn by the climate and Florida's favorable tax laws. Ronald settled into a high-end fourth-floor apartment, wealthy, retired, and looking for comfort. He embraced this new chapter, and then, as if history were looping back, Ronald and Catherine reconnected when Catherine Pytha, same flight attendant, Ronald Vinci had once loved and lost in his life. It seemed like a second chance at romance. She moved into his Fort Lauderdale apartment, high above the city skyline. Curiously, her ex-husband, Delio Corano, lived in the same building 30 floors below Delio. Baffled by her decision, couldn't understand why Catherine had returned to the man she had once described as a monster despite the complicated history. Their relationship resumed. Neither Ronald nor Catherine was working by then. Their days were slow, luxurious, and filled with stark contrast. Ronald, now overweight, delighted in rich foods and rowdy nights with friends. Catherine, slender at just 42 kilograms, ate like a bird and avoided crowds, while Ronald was the life of every party. Loud, a commanding presence, Catherine preferred solitude, staying home in shorts and sneakers. Engrossed in crime novels, she rarely dressed up and seldom spoke unless spoken to. Yet they traveled often by boat, by air, visiting Caribbean islands together, despite a paralyzing fear of water documented in her personal diaries. Catherine pushed herself to follow Ronald's lead. He urged her to conquer her fear, and she, eager to please, complied, though worth millions. Ronald was oddly frugal. He frequented cheap waterfront bars in Fort Lauderdale, where he'd order strong drinks and dollar tacos there, surrounded by friends. He would brag, joke, and flirt freely at home. Parties were frequent, and so was the alcohol. Catherine usually took a back seat, quietly serving drinks and snacks, catering to guests, and attending to Ronald's increasingly erratic behavior. Wasn't uncommon for Ronald to insult her in front of others, suggesting half in jest, half in cruelty that she owed him everything. Theirs was a relationship of imbalance. Ronald, loud and dominant, Catherine passive and yielding. This strange, almost performative dynamic dragged on for 5 years, and still, despite Catherine's growing desperation, Ronald never proposed. By 2010, the cracks were widening. Ronald began telling friends he was ready to move on. He wanted someone younger, someone less emotionally burdensome. Then, in early 2011, his health took a sharp turn. He was hospitalized for severe intestinal problems, issues doctors believed were rooted in decades of alcohol abuse. Ronald complained that his food had begun to taste strange. One friend joked, "Maybe Catherine's trying to poison you." Ronald laughed it off. But behind the humor was a body breaking down, ravaged by alcohol, prescription pills, and years of excess. In June 2011, Ronald made a major decision. He purchased a waterfront home in Fort Lauderdale. For $3 million, it was elegant, spacious, and located just steps from his beloved yacht at 70. Ronald envisioned this home as his final retreat, a place to relax, to host his son Carrie and young grandson, and to live out the remainder of his life in peace. But peace would never come. On the afternoon of June 28, 2011, Ronald Vinci's gardener made a panicked 911 call. His voice shook as he reported a horrifying scene. His employer was dead. When police arrived at the luxury home, they discovered Ronald's lifeless body in one of the guest bedrooms that had been meticulously wrapped in layers plastic bags, soiled sheets, a sleeping bag, and bound tightly with tape. A strange dark substance had been poured over it. Wet coffee grounds, later confirmed by forensic teams beneath the bed. Investigators found a mattress slashed open, soaked with blood. When questioned, the gardener revealed something even more disturbing. Catherine Pye had called him the night before, frantically begging for his help. She said Ronald had fallen down the stairs, hit his head, and died. She was in tears, panicked, but her next request was chilling. She asked him to help dispose of the body, Catherine claimed. Ronald had always wanted a burial at sea, and she was trying to honor that wish she had already purchased. A large blue container to store the body, and had placed it in the garage. Her plan was to take the container out on Ronald's yacht and lower it into the ocean by the time authorities were called. The container was already in her possession, and preparations were underway when the medical examiner finally unwrapped the body. The findings were brutal. Ronald Vinci, aged 70, hadn't simply fallen, he had sustained 9. The autopsy results were harrowing. Ronald Vinci had sustained 9 stab wounds delivered with vicious precision to his chest and neck. There were also signs of blunt force trauma to his skull, consistent with hammer blows, but what ultimately ended his life was a gunshot wound to the head. Investigators traced the timeline back to the evening of June 27, 2011. That night, Ronald hosted a casual dinner gathering at his new waterfront home. Catherine prepared the meal, while Ronald poured drinks for their guests during dinner. Ronald voiced some concerns. He noticed one of his pistols was missing, and mentioned that his passport had also vanished. He also complained that the food tasted oddly bitter. Then, in an uncharacteristic move, Ronald excused himself early, known for staying up well past midnight. He went to bed at 7:30 p.m. sharp. His guests, puzzled by this strange behavior, left shortly afterward. In the early hours of June 28, Catherine Pye, then 54 years old, was brought in for questioning. It wasn't long before she gave detectives a chilling, detailed confession. According to her, around 1:00 a.m., the heavily intoxicated Ronald had awakened in a rage. He began verbally assaulting her, screaming, threatening. At one point, he chased her down the stairs but lost his footing and fell, striking his head violently. Catherine claimed she helped him up and led him to a guest bedroom on the first floor. Then, she said, she cleaned the bloodstains from the staircase. A few hours later, she returned to check on him. Ronald was asleep, but next to him on the nightstand sat a loaded handgun. That's when fear gave way to something darker. Catherine told investigators that she believed Ronald intended to kill her. Terrified and enraged, she grabbed the gun and shot him in the head as he slept. What happened next pushed the case from a possible self-defense claim into something far more brutal. Catherine admitted that, after the shooting, she stabbed Ronald multiple times and struck him repeatedly with a hammer. She said she felt as though her soul had left her body completely detached from what she was doing. She then wrapped Ronald's body in bags and bedding and called the gardener, hoping for help in disposing of the corpse. Her plan, she told him, was to honor Ronald's supposed wish for a burial at sea. Surveillance footage later confirmed that she had purchased a large blue container at a hardware store, intending to use it to transport the body aboard his yacht. Detectives searched her Bentley. The evidence was damning inside. They found the murder weapon covered in her fingerprints, a knife, fragments of a mattress, blood-soaked clothing, and rubber gloves, all stained with Ronald's blood. Were also discovered in her vehicle. The blue container was sitting in the garage, just as the gardener had described. Catherine Pye was arrested and charged with first-degree murderers. The investigation deepened. More troubling details surfaced just 1 month earlier, in May 2011. Catherine had been involved in a legal battle with her own sister over a loan. Her sister claimed Catherine had borrowed money and refused to pay it back. Catherine insisted it was a gift. The court ruled in her favor. Neighbors recalled hearing screams from Ronald's home the night of the murder. A witness even reported seeing a white car with a large trailer parked outside early that morning. It belonged to the gardener. Ronald's friends painted a bleak picture of the couple's final months. The relationship had all but collapsed. They weren't intimate, they slept in separate rooms, and Ronald had allegedly tried to end things once and for all, offering Catherine $1 million through a staff member in exchange for her leaving the home for good. Prosecutors believed the motive was clear. Fear of abandonment. Catherine stood to lose her partner, her lifestyle, and her financial stability rather than leave empty-handed. She killed, but her defense team told a different story. They claimed Catherine had endured years of psychological and emotional abuse. That night, they argued, she snapped, acting in self-defense. A court-appointed psychiatrist found Signs of trauma consistent with long-term abuse. Some of Catherine's relatives supported that claim, but no friends, staff, or neighbors ever witnessed Ronald mistreating her. No one heard complaints. No one saw bruises. During the trial, Catherine dropped a bombshell. She accused Ronald of being involved in the death of her younger sister, Angela, 3 years earlier, in December 2009. The three of them, Catherine, Angela, and Ronald, had taken a Caribbean cruise. Angela, battling substance abuse, had consumed large amounts of alcohol at a party on board. She became violently ill, suffered intense seizures, and eventually collapsed. Catherine attempted CPR, but Angela died. It came to light that Ronald had given Angela some pills that night, supposedly to help her relax. Catherine firmly believed those pills played a role in her sister's death. Whether that accusation was a genuine revelation or an attempt to sway the jury, it did little to change the outcome. In 2014, Catherine Pye was found guilty of the murder of Ronald Vinci. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. She is currently serving that sentence behind bars, far from the ocean view she once shared with the man she claimed to love and later killed. Catherine Pye, the former flight attendant Ronald Vinci had once dated, eventually moved into his apartment and rekindled their relationship curiously. Her ex-husband, Dilo Carano, lived in the same high-rise 30 floors below. Dilo was baffled by Catherine's decision to reunite with a man she had once described as a monster. As their relationship progressed, Catherine became increasingly obsessed with marrying Ronald. Neither of them worked anymore, enjoying a leisurely lifestyle instead, but stark differences between them began to emerge. Ronald was overweight and indulged in rich foods, while Catherine, weighing only 42 kilograms, ate sparingly to maintain her petite frame. He thrived at parties, whereas she preferred quiet nights at home. Engrossed in crime novels, Catherine rarely wore dresses, instead opting for shorts and sneakers despite her documented fear of the ocean, detailed in her personal diaries. Ron often pushed her to face it, taking her on boat rides and island-hopping trips. Though Ronald was wealthy, he preferred budget-friendly bars along Fort Lauderdale's waterfront there. He mingled with locals, drank heavily, and flirted with other women, often joking that his charm had faded with age. At home, he frequently hosted raucous gatherings where his alcohol-fueled outbursts sometimes turned cruel. He would insult Catherine in front of guests, insinuating that she owed everything to him. Catherine, in contrast, remained quiet and compliant, serving snacks and drinks to Ron and his friends, always playing the accommodating hostess. This dynamic, his boisterous dominance versus her subdued obedience, persisted for 5 years. Yet despite their long-term relationship, Ron remained hesitant to propose. By 2010, he began confiding in friends that he wanted to end things and find a younger companion. In early 2011, Ronald Vinci was hospitalized with serious intestinal problems, most likely due to years of alcohol abuse. Doctors warned him his drinking was destroying his body. Ronald, however, remarked that his food had started tasting strange, prompting a friend to joke that maybe Catherine was poisoning him. Ron laughed it off, never seriously considering the possibility. That June, Ronald purchased a $3 million waterfront home in Fort Lauderdale, just steps from where his yacht was docked. At age 70, he looked forward to relaxing in his new home, hosting visits from his only son Carrie and his grandson Carrie, a waiter by profession, was often the subject of Ron's sarcastic jabs. Ron joked that his son was only waiting for him to die. Then came the fateful day on June 28, 2011. Ronald's gardener made a frantic call to 911 when police arrived at the new property. They discovered Ronald Vinci's lifeless body in a guest bedroom. It had been tightly wrapped in plastic bags and sealed with tape inside a sleeping bag. The body was buried under soiled sheets and coffee grounds. Investigators found a mattress beneath the bed with visible slash marks and bloodstains. When questioned, the gardener relayed a disturbing story. According to Catherine Pye, Ron had fallen down the stairs, hit his head, and died. She claimed it was an accident, but investigators had serious doubts during formal interrogation. The gardener confessed that Catherine had called him late the previous night, frantically asking him to come over when he arrived the next morning. He was horrified to find Ron's corpse tightly wrapped and stashed in a guest room. Catherine, crying and distressed, begged him to help bury the body at sea, claiming it had always been Ron's wish to be laid to rest in the ocean. She had even purchased a large blue storage container for the task, which was already stored in the garage by the time police intervened. The medical examiner's report told a far more sinister story. Ronald Vinci had been brutally attacked, stabbed 9 times in the chest and neck, bludgeoned in the head with what appeared to be a hammer, and ultimately shot in the head. The official time of death was determined to be the evening of June 27th. That night, friends had joined Ronald for dinner. Catherine prepared the food, and Ronald provided drinks during the meal. He mentioned that his passport and one of his pistols were missing. He also complained that the food tasted strangely bitter. Uncharacteristically, he retired to bed early around 7:30 p.m., a move his friends found odd, considering his usual night owl habits. Just a few hours later, Catherine Pye, then 54, was taken into custody and gave a chilling confession around 1 a.m. She claimed a heavily intoxicated Ronald woke up and began yelling at her. He chased her down the stairs before tripping and hitting his head. Catherine said she helped him up and guided him to a guest room, then cleaned the blood from the staircase. A few hours later, she checked on him and found a loaded gun on the nightstand. Fearing for her life, she claimed she grabbed the weapon and shot him in the head. She said she acted in fear and rage, feeling as if her soul had left her body then, in what appeared to be a frenzy. She stabbed him multiple times and struck him with a hammer afterward. She wrapped the body and called the gardener to help her dispose of it. Surveillance footage later showed Catherine purchasing the large blue container at a hardware store. Police recovered the murder weapon from her car, with her fingerprints on it. Her Bentley was also found to contain a blood-stained knife, cut-up pieces of the mattress, and rubber gloves, all bearing Ronald's blood. She was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Further investigation uncovered troubling financial tensions just 1 month before the murder. Catherine had been involved in a legal dispute with her sister, who claimed Catherine refused to repay a loan. Catherine insisted the money was a gift and won the case in May 2011. Meanwhile, neighbors told police they'd heard screaming from Ronald's house the night he died. One witness reported seeing a white car with a trailer parked near the property. It was the gardener's vehicle. Ronald's friends revealed he had been planning to end the relationship. They hadn't been intimate for months and slept in separate bedrooms. Just weeks before his death, he had offered Catherine $1 million through an intermediary to leave the house. Permanently, prosecutors argued that Catherine's motive was fear of losing financial security. Her defense, however, claimed she had been a long-term victim of abuse and acted in self-defense, but questions lingered. Why didn't she call 911? Why did she lie? Why remain in a relationship she claimed was abusive? Some family members supported her claims. A court-appointed psychiatrist noted signs consistent with domestic violence. Still, none of Ronald's friends ever witnessed mistreatment or heard Catherine complain during the trial. Catherine made a shocking claim that Ronald was involved in her younger sister, Angela's sudden death in December 2009. Ronald, Catherine, and Angela had taken a Caribbean cruise. Angela, who struggled with substance abuse, became violently ill during a party after reportedly taking pills Ronald had given her. Despite Catherine's desperate attempts to revive her, Angela died of cardiac arrest. Catherine believed the pills Ronald provided contributed to her sister's death. In 2014, a jury found Catherine Pye guilty of murdering Ronald Vinci. She was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Catherine is currently serving her sentence at Lowell Correctional Institution in Marion County, Florida. She is scheduled for release in January 2034, when she will be 77. Ronald Vinci, a self-made millionaire, had made many wise decisions in his life, but his final relationship would prove to be a fatal one. Their first date took place at Houston's in Irvine, California, from the outset. John aimed to captivate Deborah and he succeeded. He spun elaborate tales about his past, claiming he had worked with Doctors Without Borders in Iraq. He said he had 2 children and owned several properties to Deborah. He appeared to be a selfless, worldly doctor, someone devoted to both medicine and love. John treated her like royalty, and for a woman who had longed for sincere companionship, it was exactly what she needed to hear. He even expressed a strong desire to meet her family. Further endearing himself to her after dinner, they returned to her penthouse. But that night, John crossed a boundary. What began as a few kisses quickly turned into unwanted pressure for more. Deborah, feeling uncomfortable and alarmed, asked him to leave the next morning. John called to apologize. He said he had been drinking and became overwhelmed with emotion. The admission, oddly enough, softened Deborah's view of him. She appreciated the vulnerability, and they continued dating as their relationship progressed. They spent more time together. By their 3rd date, John had already declared his Levant, even proposed. Deborah, caught up in the whirlwind romance, began to overlook glaring red flags. John wore the same worn-out medical scrubs everywhere, even to Deborah's upscale social events, he claimed. He was always too busy to change. Deborah, proud of her new relationship, brushed it off and introduced him to friends as her doctor. Proudly posing for photos with him, their connection intensified, and soon they decided to live together. Deborah's daughter, Jacqueline, who also lived in the penthouse, was immediately suspicious. Known for her blunt honesty, Jacqueline criticized John's unkempt appearance and couldn't understand why her elegant mother, who dressed in Gucci and Cartier, would be drawn to a man in threadbare scrubs. Jacqueline also noticed how John often stared at the artwork, sculptures, and decor in the penthouse, as if appraising their value within just 5 weeks. John persuaded Deborah to rent a separate house. For them, they settled on a $6,500 a month waterfront home on Balboa Island. Deborah paid $80,000 up front to secure the lease. Curiously, John refused to put his name on any documents, citing vague tax complications. Still enamored, Deborah covered all the expenses and didn't tell her children about the move. She couldn't understand their hostility. John was attentive, made her morning coffee, did the grocery shopping, and tried to simplify her life. She felt she had finally found her perfect match, and hoped, in time, her family would come to accept him. Determined to create harmony, Deborah arranged for John to meet her younger daughter, Tara, who was known for her gentle demeanor. Tara, who lived in Las Vegas with her boyfriend, had only heard about John through phone calls when she visited. Her impression was immediate and uneasy from the moment they met. Tara found John's demeanor cold and forced. His behavior during the move was off-putting. He worked in silence, with an oddly intense focus, trying to project toughness despite her discomfort. Tara gave him a chance, but soon her instincts kicked in. John didn't have a car, and although he spoke of owning properties in Newport Beach and Palm Springs, he never invited them over or suggested moving. He spent most of his time at home, often playing video games for hours. Something didn't add up. Just before Thanksgiving, Tara looked through John's belongings, made a stunning discovery. She found a nurse's certificate with his name, confirming what she had suspected. John wasn't a doctor. When confronted, John exploded. He accused Tara of trying to destroy her mother's happiness and ranted that she was jealous. Deborah stood by silently. The confrontation ended with a heated argument and Tara leaving the house. John quickly manipulated the situation. He told Deborah that her children were only after her money, that they were waiting for her to die and couldn't stand to see her happy. Then came Thanksgiving. Deborah's mother, Arlena, devoutly religious woman, arrived to join the celebration. John, trying to impress, put on a performative display of faith, but Arlen wasn't fooled. Instead of winning her over, John triggered yet another scandal within the family. The holiday unraveled into chaos in the aftermath. Deborah sought help from a psychotherapist, who advised her to set healthy boundaries with her children and focus on peace in her own life. She took that advice to heart. She and John settled into their Balboa Island home, enjoying dinners at local restaurants, sunset strolls, and the picturesque waterfront at times. John behaved like a youthful romantic, taking shirtless selfies, engaging in playful banter, and lavishing Deborah with attention. It was everything she thought she had wanted, but even then, something felt off despite their closeness. John's appearance never changed. His wardrobe remained the same, aging medical scrubs, frayed pants, and worn shirts. Deborah, always dressed impeccably, began to quietly question how such an odd pairing had become her reality. Deborah valued style and sophistication in a partner, someone who could complement her elegant way of life. When she brought up John's wardrobe, he claimed his designer clothing had been stolen during his time in Iraq. To help him rebuild his closet, Deborah took him on an extravagant shopping spree, outfitting him in high-end designer clothing from head to toe. In early December, less than 2 months after meeting John, accompanied Deborah on a business trip to Las Vegas. While there, the couple made a spontaneous decision. They got married. Deborah kept the marriage a secret from her children, knowing they disapproved of the relationships. Soon after their return, an incident occurred that John quickly turned to his advantage. A strange woman managed to enter their home, prompting John to insist they needed tighter security. He installed several surveillance cameras throughout the house, all of which he controlled from his phone. But his obsession with control didn't stop there. He extended the surveillance to Deborah's office, claiming it was for her safety, but in truth, it was to monitor her every move. As time passed, Deborah began asking questions about John's background, his family, his past, his career. Every question was met with a carefully crafted response. His stories were inconsistent, yet Deborah chose to ignore the red flags, convinced she had found her soulmate. Her children, however, remained deeply suspicious. Jacqueline, always observant, noticed that John still didn't own a car and relied entirely on Deborah's Tesla. Determined to uncover the truth, she planted a tracking device on the vehicle, but her efforts yielded no obvious red flags. Undeterred, Jacqueline and Tara hired a private investigator. The findings were damning. John had filed for bankruptcy. He held a nursing license but not one to practice medicine. He had lived in several states, including Arizona, Ohio, Indiana, Tennessee, and California. One of the addresses linked to him was the Orange County jail. When the daughters confronted their mother with the truth, Deborah refused to be swayed. Even if the revelations were accurate, she told them her feelings for John wouldn't change. Then, in late March, Deborah received a letter addressed to John. The sender was a former prison inmate. Before she could read it, John snatched it from her hands. He first lashed out in anger, accusing her of mistrust, then claimed it was from a pen pal he was supporting emotionally. The explanation didn't sit well with Deborah. The next day, while John was away at the hospital for back issues, Deborah searched through his belongings and uncovered the terrifying truth. She discovered that John had once been a nurse anesthetist, but had lost everything due to an addiction to painkillers. His arrest had ended his medical career. She found court documents detailing his past as a fraudster, someone who had manipulated and stolen from multiple women. A search warrant for one of his storage units revealed a .38 caliber handgun, ammunition, a GPS tracker, syringes, and other alarming items. At that moment, Deborah realized who she had really married. John was not just deceitful. He was dangerous. He was a convicted felon, with multiple restraining orders filed against him by other women. Most chilling of all, he had been released from prison on October 8th and met her just days later, shaken and terrified. Deborah pored over every document she found. The picture of the man she married was not only false, it was disturbing. Fearing for her life and the safety of her children, she decided to stay calm and wait for the right moment to leave. When John returned to the hospital for further treatment, Deborah acted with the help of her family. She quietly packed her things and moved out while he was away. During the move, they uncovered even more disturbing documents, printouts of online posts written by other women who had been targeted by John. The comments warned others of his manipulative charm, describing him as a skilled liar who preyed on wealthy women. Deborah, now fully convinced of the danger he posed, ended the relationship, but John wasn't finished. He continued to message her, begging her to visit him in the hospital. Overwhelmed with guilt and still emotionally entangled, Deborah eventually gave in. By June 2015, John had managed to worm his way back into her life. He offered more excuses, admitting that he had lied about being a doctor because he believed a woman like her would never give him a chance. Otherwise, he begged for her help in turning his life around. Still emotionally attached, Deborah agreed to try again. They moved into a new apartment in Irvine together. But this second chance came at a cost. Her children were devastated. Unable to understand her decision, they distanced themselves from their mother, and Deborah and John kept their distance in return. By March 2016, the couple had been married for a year. Deborah spent 3 of those months helping John detox and recover from his addiction, but emotionally, she was unraveling despite her efforts. Her entire family had turned away from her, and the man she had risked everything for continued to cast a long shadow over her life. John never made an effort to bond with Deborah's children. In fact, the tension was palpable, especially with her daughter Jacqueline, known as Yas. Their mutual dislike escalated over time. At one point, John even forbade Deborah from seeing her own daughter when he found out Deborah was financially supporting Jacqueline's real estate coursework. He retaliated cruelly. John contacted the school, attempting to tarnish Jacqueline's reputation by spreading lies to her instructors. He also sent her disturbing messages, some threatening, others vulgar, claiming her mother had disowned her and warning that he would one day come to harm her. Though John appeared to be recovering, on the surface, it was clear his manipulative and violent tendencies were intensifying. By April 2016, Deborah had reached her breaking point. She filed for divorce, hoping to end the relationship peacefully. Quietly, she began withdrawing money from her bank account and stashing it away for safety. Unfortunately, she kept $30,000 hidden in a lower drawer in their home. When John discovered it, he insisted the money was rightfully his. As the reality of the divorce settled in, John's behavior grew increasingly volatile. Sensing imminent danger, Deborah fled the home, taking only essential cosmetics and work supplies. She found refuge at Jacqueline's apartment in Irvine, where a strong security system gave her some peace of mind. Deborah tried to secure a restraining order, but her request was denied by an Orange County judge who cited a lack of immediate threat. John had moved to another state and hadn't made any recent direct attempts to approach her, at least not officially. Determined to cut ties and move on, Deborah focused on rebuilding her life. John, meanwhile, had relocated to one of Deborah's rental properties in Nevada. From there, he continued calling her, but she refused to engage. Then, things took a sinister turn. On June 11, 2016, while Deborah was at work, her Jaguar was stolen from the office parking lot. The vehicle was found just a short distance away, soaked in gasoline, an obvious attempt to set it ablaze. Though no fire had been started, security footage left no doubt about who was responsible: John Mayan. The message was clear: he was still a threat, no matter where he lived. Just 2 months later, on the night of August 20th, 2016, the violence escalated. Deborah's daughter, Tara, returned home from work and parked her car. As she stepped out, John suddenly emerged from the shadows and attacked her with a knife. Attempting to shove her back into her vehicle, Tara screamed and fought back fiercely when he tried to silence her by covering her mouth. She bit him hard, wearing heavy boots. Tara kicked him with all her strength, eventually knocking the weapon from his hand in a desperate bid for survival. She grabbed the knife and stabbed him 13 times. The final blow pierced his eye. Shaken and bleeding, Tara was lucky a neighbor had witnessed the struggle and rushed to her aid, pressing a towel to her wounds while calling the police. Paramedics arrived to find John barely clinging to life in his car. Investigators found duct tape, zip ties, kitchen knives, and a passport, evidence suggesting he had planned to abduct Tara and possibly flee the area. John Mune died 4 days later in the hospital at the age of 57. He was cremated, and no funeral service was held by that time. He had alienated nearly everyone who had ever known him. The aftermath left Deborah and her children emotionally devastated. Though grateful Tara had survived, Deborah was racked with guilt for having ever brought John into their lives. It took time for her to feel safe again, and even now, she carries a stun gun and pepper spray wherever she goes. She has since vowed never to meet anyone online again. Postscript. The story of Jamie. Jamie Hahn was born on October 25, 1983, in Orangeburg, South Carolina. She grew up in a blended family with her sister Ashley and brothers Brett and Justin. Despite her parents' divorce and remarriage, Jamie remained cheerful and driven. She attended a prestigious private prep school known for its academic excellence during a junior high school trip to the University of North Carolina. Jamie fell in love with the campus and set her heart on attending even as a student. She showed a passion for helping others, volunteering with the Center of Hope, which supported at-risk youth. Later, she became deeply involved in politics, participating in several campaigns, including Senator John Edwards' 2008 presidential bid. Jamie emerged as a rising star within North Carolina's Democratic Party. It was during one of these campaigns that she met Nation, a fellow strategist and rising figure in digital political outreach. What started as a professional partnership gradually blossomed into romance. Just 4 months after their relationship turned romantic, they announced their engagement and married on April 18, 2009. Friends described their connection as rooted in deep friendship and mutual respect. Jamie ran her own political fundraising consultancy, while Nation became known for his work helping candidates and nonprofits amplify their message online. Together, they were a political power couple, admired not just for their success, but for their kindness and compassion. Tender, generous, and well-regarded, Jamie and Nation Hahn were a couple admired by many. They took their marriage vows seriously, actively participating in public service initiatives like the Coalition to Protect Young Families in North Carolina. Although they had not yet started a family, the couple had plans for children in the near future. Jamie, in particular, was known for her vibrant social presence and heartfelt compassion. Her political acumen and infectious energy left a mark on everyone she encountered. Friends and colleagues often said she had the rare ability to make any room brighter, and her future seemed promising. But on April 22, 2013, the Hahn's seemingly perfect world imploded around 5:20 p.m. Jamie was seen sprinting from her house, her body covered in blood. She collapsed just a few yards away in a neighbor's yard. Onlookers, stunned and horrified, shouted for someone to call 911. One neighbor rushed to her aid, quickly placing a towel over the deep abdominal wounds. While listening to Jamie's frantic, disoriented words through her panic, the neighbor understood she had been attacked by someone named John. Someone who was still inside the house. Police arrived quickly and followed a blood trail from the yard back to the Hahn residence with weapons drawn. They ordered the suspect to come out. Moments later, a bald, disheveled man emerged on the front porch. He appeared injured, with stab wounds on his wrist and abdomen. He was immediately transported to the hospital, escorted by law enforcement. During the ride, the man grew emotional, repeatedly muttering that he wished he were dead, expressing regret that this didn't happen sooner. He was soon identified as 31-year-old Jonathan Wayne Brill. Nation Hahn's close friend and a frequent guest in the Hahn household. Jamie also knew him well. She had even hired Jonathan as the accountant for her political consulting firm when he relocated to North Carolina. Nation and Jonathan had a long history, having first met in 2000 during a church trip back in their hometown. Despite a age gap, they forged a strong friendship. Though they eventually lost touch during college years, they rekindled their bond after graduation and quickly became inseparable. Brill was so close to the couple that he had served as the best man at their wedding in April 2009. To neighbors and friends, Jonathan Brill was like an extension of the Hahn family, always around for Monday dinners, holidays, and vacations. The trio was often described as the Three Musketeers, united by deep trust and loyalties. So how did it come to this? In the months leading up to the attack, the Hans had been especially concerned about Brill. He had recently confided that he had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer, an aggressive and often terminal illness. The couple accompanied him to doctor appointments, offered emotional support, and even opened their home to him during his treatments. There had been past health concerns too. Brill once told Nation that he was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis following a gallbladder surgery. His health history was filled with complications. Hans never hesitated to help on the day of the incident. As part of their regular Monday dinners, Brill arrived at the house earlier than usual to discuss campaign work with Jamie. When Nation came home and headed upstairs to change, he heard Jamie scream first. She called his name then. With rising panic, she screamed for John, alarmed. Nation rushed down the stairs midway. He heard his wife cry out in terror. Someone was trying to stab her. What he saw in the kitchen was something no husband should ever witness. Jamie was lying on the floor, drenched in blood. Towering above her was Jonathan, holding a large kitchen knife. Before Nation could process the horror, Brill turned toward him, knife still in hand, and began advancing. The nightmare unfolded in mere minutes. In a desperate act of self-defense, Nation grabbed the blade of the knife with one hand, while striking Jonathan in the face with the other. Amid the chaos, he screamed for Jamie to run. Trying to subdue someone who, until moments ago, had been his closest friend was almost beyond comprehension. Despite the severity of her injuries, Jamie somehow managed to rise and flee through the side door once she was out of harm's way. Nation pushed Jonathan aside and ran after her, bleeding heavily. Jamie staggered toward a nearby house and banged on the door, crying for help. But no one answered, summoning the last of her strength. She tried to reach the next house but collapsed unconscious in the yard, drawn by the sounds of chaos and Jamie's cries. Passers-by rushed to her aid. One neighbor quickly called 911 while others tried to help. However, they could. Meanwhile, Nation was frantically searching for her. Following a trail of blood through the neighborhood, he found her in a neighbor's yard, barely conscious. Curled on her side and clinging to life, he knelt beside her, took her hand, and whispered comfort through his tears, promises of recovery, anniversaries, and vacations by the sea. But the damage was extensive. Another neighbor brought a towel to press against Jamie's bleeding abdomen. Though it quickly became soaked with blood, someone else gently raised her legs onto a bag of leaves. In an attempt to stabilize her, the wait for the ambulance felt endless. Even though it was only minutes, Jamie's breathing grew labored out. Clear sign she was in critical condition. When paramedics arrived, they acted quickly. Both Jamie and Nation were rushed to the hospital, he with deep lacerations to his hand from grappling the knife. She slipping in and out of consciousness. Jamie was rushed into emergency surgery. Nation, still in shock and barely aware of his own wounds, received stitches for his injuries. All he could think about was his wife. Repeatedly, he tried to push his way into the ICU, desperate for any update on her condition, but was turned away as he sat on a hospital bed, bloodied and broken. Nation was tormented by thoughts of what had happened. Over a dozen stab wounds, a severed artery, severe liver damage. His only hope was a miracle. For a moment, it seemed like one might arrive. Jamie survived the surgery, but she never regained consciousness. 2 days later, she died from her injuries. The autopsy report was devastating. Jamie had sustained 24 stab wounds to her face, neck, back, hands, and forearms, many of which were defensive, but it was the deep wounds to her abdomen and chest that proved fatal, causing massive damage to her lungs and liver. Meanwhile, Jonathan Brill, who had inflicted stab wounds on himself during or after the attack, was hospitalized for 8 days on April 30th, 2013. Still bandaged and requiring care, he was wheeled on a stretcher into the Wake County Magistrate's office. He was formally charged with the first-degree murder of Jamie Hahn and assault with a deadly weapon with intent to kill. Nation Hahn, given the severity of the charges, Brill was held without bail and transferred to Central Prison in Raleigh, which has a hospital wing equipped to treat inmates requiring medical care. The loss of Jamie devastated the community. The tragedy left everyone asking one haunting question: why would someone so close to the Hahn family commit such a brutal act? In the aftermath, speculation grew over a possible motive. During the months leading up to the attack, over $50,000 had gone missing from Jamie's political campaign fund. Jonathan Brill, who had served as the campaign's accountant, had officially ended his role with the company at the close of 2012, but he continued to assist Jamie with financial matters, and reports it's believed that Jamie may have discovered the discrepancy and planned to confront Brill about the missing funds during their regular Monday dinner on April 22nd. What exactly transpired during Nation's brief time upstairs remains uncertain, but many believe the confrontation spiraled into a frenzied and violent attack, one that ended in betrayal, loss, and here it's believed that Jamie may have confronted Jonathan about the missing campaign funds during that fateful dinner. While Nation's physical wounds eventually began to heal, the emotional and psychological scars remained deep and unrelenting. 6 months after Jamie's death, Nation and her family gathered to scatter her ashes near Pulaski Memorial Baptist Church, a place that had meant a great deal to her. Jamie had volunteered there often, giving her time and energy to causes that uplifted others. In a tragic twist, just 1 week before the attack, Nation and Jamie had asked the church pastor to pray for Jonathan, believing he was battling cancer. Little did they know that soon it would be they who needed prayers, facing an unimaginable loss at the hands of someone they had trusted and loved like family. For Nation, the emotional fallout was incomprehensible. The man he had known since childhood, his closest friend, had not only betrayed him but had violently taken away the love of his life. Jamie wasn't just his wife. She was, as he said, his anchor, his backbone, his soulmate. In his words, he couldn't understand how the sun could continue to shine without her. The trial of Jonathan Brill began on March 4, 2015. Prosecutors laid bare the motive. Jonathan, acting as the campaign's financial manager, had written 39 fraudulent checks to himself, embezzling around $50,000, the exact sum that had gone missing, to justify his actions. Jonathan claimed he was suffering from multiple serious health issues: brain damage from multiple sclerosis, memory problems, a gallbladder surgery, and even pancreatic cancer. Jamie, known for her compassion, chose not to confront him aggressively. She tried to give him space, gently hoping he would come clean and correct his mistake, until a debt collector called her directly. Then came a shocking revelation. According to the district attorney, Jonathan's first hospital admission, where he claimed he was gravely ill, occurred only after an incident at the Hahn's residence. Prior to that, his medical records showed no history of treatment. There had been no gallbladder surgery, no multiple sclerosis, and no cancer. It had all been a carefully crafted lie. A review of his internet search history painted a grim picture. Jonathan had been researching symptoms of pancreatic cancer and medical specialists in order to convincingly fake his condition. He had also looked up cruises that didn't require a passport, and chillingly, he had purchased a one-way ticket to Las Vegas for April 23rd, just 1 day after the attack. He canceled it 2 hours before stabbing Jamie. Eventually, Jonathan confessed he had stolen the money, fabricated his illnesses, and deceived his closest friends, while the Hahns sat in their car, waiting outside doctors' offices, believing they were supporting him during difficult times. Jonathan was merely wandering hospital corridors in the lead-up to the attack. Jonathan had spiraled into a deep depression. He claimed to hear voices urging him to harm others. He said he had bought the knife for the purpose of ending his own life in Las Vegas, but when Jamie confronted him about the money, something inside him snapped. He admitted that she had tried to stop him from hurting himself, but instead, he turned on her in a blind, furious rage. He recalled attacking her, but stated parts of the episode had been wiped from his memory, despite his defense team's argument for temporary insanity. The evidence was overwhelming. The jury could not ignore the planning, the deceit, or the brutality. Before the jury began deliberations, Nation Han addressed the courtroom. His voice trembled with grief as he spoke directly to his former friend We. "Lock our doors at night to keep evil out," he said, "but what happens when evil has a key?" On March 19, 2015, the jury returned its verdict. Jonathan Brill was found guilty of first-degree murder in the death of Jamie Han and of attempted murder in the assault on Nation Han. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jamie's death was both senseless and agonizingly tragic. Her intentions had been pure. She had simply wanted to give a friend the opportunity to come clean. Even Jonathan, in a later interview, admitted that if he had just told the truth, Jamie would have forgiven Jim instead. Their closest friend became their worst nightmare. Jonathan Hoffman had been living with his grandparents for 9 months following his parents' divorce and their move to Arizona, although he initially relocated with them. Life in Arizona quickly became overwhelming shortly after their arrival. Jonathan's younger sister Jessica was diagnosed with a benign brain tumor, an ordeal that required several surgeries and long-term medical care. Balancing this emotional stress with adjusting to a new school left Jonathan feeling isolated, depressed, and disoriented. So when his grandmother Sandra offered for him to return to Michigan and live with her until he graduated high school, Jonathan was overjoyed. The idea of reuniting with his friends and familiar surroundings in West Bloomfield gave him a renewed sense of hope. However, not everyone supported the arrangement. Jonathan's father, Michael Ann, experienced attorney harbored long-standing concerns about Sandra, a retired schoolteacher and mother of 5. 74-year-old Sandra Lane was known to be stern, demanding, and rigid in her ways, while she and her 85-year-old husband Fred deeply loved their grandson. Caring for a teenager during his most emotionally volatile years proved challenging despite his doubts. Michael eventually agreed to let Jonathan finish school at Farmington Central High, and in many ways, Jonathan thrived. He was known as the class clown, witty, intellectually sharp, and tech-savvy. His charisma won him a full scholarship to Eastern Michigan University. Friends described him as upbeat, optimistic, and full of life, which is why Max, his close friend since 9th grade, was immediately alarmed when he received a call from Jonathan on the afternoon of May 18, 2012. Something in Jonathan's voice was off. He sounded nervous, rattled, and afraid. Jonathan confided that he had failed a court-ordered drug test. 2 months earlier, he had been placed on probation after police found synthetic drugs in his car. Now he was terrified of how his grandmother, Sandra, would react. She had been furious. Jonathan and Max agreed to meet later that evening. Jonathan promised to text in 30 minutes to finalize plans, but 40 minutes passed with no word concerned. Max called his phone, but it rang endlessly with no answer. What Max didn't know was that by then, Jonathan would never be able to pick up again. Around 5:20 p.m., the West Bloomfield Township Police received a harrowing 911 call from Sandra Lane's residence. The caller, Jonathan, was gasping for air. Struggling to speak, he told the dispatcher he had been shot. In between panicked breaths, he pleaded for help and said he was dying. Then, chillingly, more gunshots rang out. The dispatcher listened helplessly as Jonathan cried out in agony. His voice weakened, barely audible. Then there was silence, until a woman's scream pierced through the line moments later. The call went dead by 5:30 p.m. Officers arrived at the Maple Place gated community, an affluent, quiet neighborhood primarily home to retirees. A nearby resident had reported hearing gunfire, a rare and alarming occurrence in the tranquil suburb. As police approached the tidy condominium, a final gunshot echoed from inside before they could enter. The front door creaked open. Standing there was a small, elderly woman, hands raised, blood on her clothes, and in her thinning red hair. It was Sandra Lane. In a flat, emotionless voice, she told the officers, "I just shot my grandson." The officers were stunned, but what they found inside was even more horrifying. Condo was a blood-stained crime scene. Nearly every room bore evidence of violence: bullet holes in the walls and furniture, bloody smears on the floors, and spent shell casings scattered across the entryway. A 9mm Glock 17 semi-automatic pistol lay abandoned near the door. A later search uncovered extra magazines stashed elsewhere in the home upstairs. Officers found 17-year-old Jonathan Hoffman face down in a pool of his own blood. He had sustained multiple gunshot wounds to his chest, stomach, back, and arms. The pattern of injuries suggested he had been shot at close range and repeatedly rushed Jonathan to Botsford Hospital, holding on to the slimmest hope he might survive, but by 6:00 p.m., he succumbed to his injuries. Sandra Lane was also transported to a nearby hospital for evaluation, though physically unharmed. She was examined as a precaution before being taken into custody the following day. She was formally charged with the murder of her grandson, held without bail. She awaited trial on charges of first or second-degree murder. Her guilt or innocence to be decided by a jury. The news sent shockwaves through Jonathan's community. Friends, family, and neighbors were devastated. None of them could comprehend what could have driven Sandra to such an unthinkable act. A young life, full of promise and laughter, had been extinguished in the very place where he had sought safety and support. The devastating news of Jonathan Hoffman's death spread swiftly through the quiet West Bloomfield neighborhood. The story shocked residents and dominated local media. Coverage rumors circulated about what had happened behind closed doors. Some speculated that Jonathan had recently failed the court-ordered drug test. Others focused on a broader narrative. A vulnerable teenager, reportedly battling substance abuse, left in the care of elderly grandparents after his parents moved across the country soon. Reports emerged that Jonathan had illegal synthetic drugs in his system at the time of his death, drugs which, according to medical records, had caused him serious problems in the past, just 2 weeks prior to Jonathan's shooting. Another violent event in Michigan had rattled the public. A teenager named Tia Supriano, high on hallucinogens, had attacked his family with a baseball bat, resulting in a fatality. News outlets drew chilling parallels between the two cases, raising public fear about synthetic substances that could induce psychotic or aggressive episodes. Sandra Lane's defense attorney seized on this narrative. He argued that Sandra had legitimate fears for her safety. She was, after all, managing a probationary teen with a drug history, unpredictable, physically strong, and, according to her, increasingly unstable in her account to police and later to the jury. Sandra painted a bleak picture of life inside the home. She claimed that, after returning to Michigan, Jonathan had become aggressive, volatile, and nearly impossible to control. He spent most of his time isolated indoors, associating with other teens who abused synthetic drugs. According to Sandra, Jonathan's parents never informed her of the full extent of his drug problems before sending him to live with her, and they remained largely absent during his downward spiral. Father Michael was portrayed by the defense as having effectively abandoned his son. Sandra claimed that during emotional outbursts, Jonathan would destroy his belongings, his phone, his computer monitor, and even furniture in his room. Police records corroborated some of these claims. Jonathan had been arrested on March 17, 2011. For possession of hallucinogenic substances. He received a 93-day deferred sentence, 1 year of probation, and was ordered to undergo random drug testing. Friends of Jonathan later confirmed to authorities that they were aware of his struggles with drugs. Several had attempted to steer him in a better direction, though with limited success. Sandra insisted she had tried to help her grandson. She focused on his academics, enforced rules, and urged him to stay clean. But her efforts were met with resistance. According to her husband Fred, conflict was constant from the day Jonathan moved in. The tension eventually became so unmanageable that Sandra had contacted police multiple times for assistance. She even reached out to his school for help, but no meaningful support followed. In one alarming incident, Sandra said, Jonathan had taken synthetic drugs that left him so out of control that hospital staff had to physically restrain him on a gurney. She pleaded with his parents for help, but claims Michael never came back to Michigan. Over time, Her fear grew. She confided in Fred that she no longer felt safe, not just from Jonathan, but also from the crowd he associated with, feeling increasingly cornered and unsupported. Sandra made a decision that would later become the center of her defense. She purchased a Glock 17 pistol for protection, and the morning of May 18, 2012, the day Jonathan died, Sandra took him for a scheduled drug screening. The result came back positive. A second test administered later, the same day, yielded the same result. Jonathan, now facing potential jail time, became enraged inside Sandra's vehicle. He lashed out violently, screaming obscenities, kicking the dashboard, and at one point grabbing the steering wheel. Sandra was forced to stop the car multiple times. He even tried to seize her car keys once they returned home. Tensions escalated even further. Jonathan demanded $2,000 in cash and the car keys, insisting he was leaving immediately for Arizona. Sandra refused, with her husband Fred out, walking the family dog. She became increasingly panicked. She tried to calm her grandson, but her words had no effect. In fear, she retreated to her bedroom and retrieved the loaded pistol. Her hope, she later claimed, was that simply displaying the weapon would command Jonathan's attention, perhaps even deter him, but instead of backing down, Sandra said, Jonathan responded with rage when she approached him upstairs. She found him in the bathroom. She alleged that he cursed at her, kicked her in the stomach, and struck her in the head. A struggle ensued, and the gun discharged. Frightened and disoriented, Sandra fled to the basement to compose herself, but moments later, she said she returned upstairs to check on him, only for Jonathan to attack again during a second struggle. She claimed he tried to wrestle the gun away from her. It was during this altercation, according to her account, that she fired again. Self-defense. That was the foundation of Sandra Lane's story, a narrative that framed an elderly woman and her husband as helpless victims, cornered by a troubled and violent teenager. In her telling, the shooting of Jonathan was a desperate act by a grandmother, overwhelmed with fear, doing what she believed was necessary to protect herself and her home. But as investigators dug deeper, a very different picture began to take shape, one that was still tragic, but far more troubling. Sandra's portrayal of Jonathan as erratic and aggressive didn't align with how others knew him. Classmates and teachers described Jonathan as warm, funny, and intellectually gifted, the kind of student who could diffuse tension with a joke rather than provoke it. He was never known to be confrontational. Friends testified that they hadn't noticed any recent changes in his demeanor. There was no pattern of violence, number trail of destruction, only the quiet sadness of a teenager navigating life under the heavy expectations of others. Physically, Jonathan wasn't imposing either. He stood at just 167 meters, about 5'6", and weighed barely 50 kilograms, around 110 pounds. His build was slight, nearly identical to Sandra's. The idea that he posed a serious physical threat became increasingly difficult for many to believe. Most of the claims about Jonathan's so-called violent outbursts came solely from Sandra herself. Fred, Sandra's husband, did confirm frequent arguments between them, heated and emotional, but never once did he witness physical violence. He was almost always at home and had expressed concerns, even suggesting that perhaps Jonathan should be sent back to his parents in Arizona. But Sandra had refused. She had insisted she could handle the boy. Their daughter Jennifer, Jonathan's mother, told investigators that during the 9 months her son lived with her parents, he kept in daily contact with her and visited frequently. At no point during that time did Sandra raise any concerns about his behavior. She never expressed fear or asked for help. When Jennifer learned about Jonathan's drug-related legal trouble, she suggested either sending him to a rehabilitation center or bringing him back home, but Sandra assured her she had everything under control. Trusting her mother, Jennifer agreed, a decision she would later describe as the most painful mistake of her life. Police had been called to the Lane residence only twice, both times offering key insights into the environment in the home. The first call came in March 2012, When Jonathan himself dialed 911 after taking magic mushrooms, he was frightened, overwhelmed by paranoia, and feared for his safety when officers arrived. They found a terrified, not violent teen. He reportedly hugged one of the officers before being secured to a stretcher for transport to a hospital just 4 days later. Sandra placed the second 911 call. She claimed Jonathan was in a rage and trying to run away, but Jonathan, speaking to the dispatcher himself, said his grandmother was trying to force him into her vehicle against his will. When police arrived, they found the two shouting at each other in the driveway. Officers offered to intervene, but Sandra declined. The encounter was logged as a verbal dispute, routine, and ultimately resolved without incident for detectives. However, these incidents painted a more nuanced picture. Rather than a grandmother under siege, they began to see a woman determined to exert control that Jonathan was increasingly resisting. By April, tensions were reaching a breaking point after Jonathan was formally placed on probation for drug possession. Sandra seemed to grow more desperate. She was losing her grip on the situation, and with graduation approaching, so was her window to correct him at this critical juncture. She faced choices. She could have involved Jennifer, sent Jonathan to rehab, or sought additional support instead. She chose to arm herself 4 days after the court hearing, on April 18, 2012. Sandra applied for a concealed carry permit that same day. She walked into a gun store and purchased a 9mm Glock, a weapon designed for deadly use. She also selected expanding bullets, ammunition intended to cause maximum internal damage. She explained to the clerk that the gun was for home protection. It wasn't just a precautionary purchase. Sandra began training regularly at a local firing range, improving her accuracy and comfort with the weapon. Her husband Fred had no idea any of this was happening. She never told him about the gun or her growing fears, and he was stunned when later he learned how much effort she had invested. In preparing herself, she was quietly preparing for something, and then, just 1 month later, on May 18, 2012, everything would come to a head. Sandra and Jonathan arrived home around 5:00 p.m. that afternoon. As they settled in, Sandra made an unusual request. She asked her husband Fred to take their dog for a walk and remain outside until she called him back in. The request was oddly specific, and as Fred recounted later, their time outside stretched on far longer than expected. Eventually, both man and dog grew tired and ended up sitting on the lawn, watching a nearby basketball game on a neighbor's driveway TV when police sirens pierced the evening air. Fred remained unaware that anything was wrong, unaware of what had just occurred inside his own home. The question still echoes today. Why did Sandra insist on being alone with Jonathan? If she was truly afraid of him, why remove her only source of protection? It didn't feel like an act of self-preservation. It felt like a plan, a deliberate attempt to ensure there would be no witnesses and no one to intervene. At that same time, precisely 5:00 p.m., Jonathan was speaking to his friend Max. The two were discussing their plans for the evening, according to Max's later testimony. Jonathan didn't sound angry or erratic. He sounded scared. He confided in Max that he was terrified about failing a drug test, and even more afraid of his grandmother's reaction. He said Sandra was furious and had threatened to send him back to Arizona. According to Sandra's version of events, Jonathan physically attacked her that evening, striking her in the head and abdomen, and she responded by firing the gun in self-defense. But when medical staff at the hospital examined her shortly after the incident, they found no visible injuries, bruises, or evidence of any assault. The forensic and ballistic evidence painted an even grimmer picture. Sandra had fired her 9mm Glock more than 10 times, and in multiple rooms throughout the house. 6 bullets struck Jonathan. 2 of those hit him in the back, clear signs he was attempting to run away. Another round struck him in the abdomen despite being wounded. Jonathan managed to call 911 and begged for help. Investigators concluded it wasn't Jonathan attacking Sandra. It was the opposite. She was pursuing him throughout the home as he tried to escape. At one point, Sandra allegedly went to the basement to reload her firearm. During that time, Jonathan managed to retreat to his bedroom upstairs and make his emergency call when Sandra returned. She located him on the floor, bleeding, helpless, and fired again, at close range, the final and most damning blow to Sandra's claim of self-defense came from the toxicology report. Jonathan's bloodstream contained no active drugs or intoxicants at the time of the shooting. The only trace of any substance was a metabolite detected in his urine, a sign of past use. Not present impairment. The medical examiner clarified that the drug had already exited his system and would have had no impact on his behavior. In other words, Jonathan was completely sober and coherent, and unarmed, when his grandmother opened fire with all the evidence stacked against her. Sandra Lane's narrative of self-defense collapsed on March 19, 2013. She was convicted of manslaughter in the shooting death of her grandson, Jonathan Hoffman. Before sentencing, Sandra tearfully expressed remorse. She claimed she never meant to kill Jonathan, that she had only wanted to help him, to fix him, but her daughter Jennifer had no forgiveness left to give. She urged the court to impose the harshest sentence possible, describing her mother as manipulative, dangerous, and completely unrepentant in her eyes. Sandra was obsessed with perfection, with academic success, and viewed Jonathan's setbacks as personal failures. Jennifer believed her mother would absolutely repeat her actions if given the chance. She's a monster. Jennifer told the court, Jonathan is in heaven now, and that's one place my mother will never reach. Sandra Lane was sentenced to a minimum of 20 years in prison, with an additional mandatory 2-year term for the use of a firearm in the commission of the crime. Her attorney pleaded for leniency, citing her advanced age and fragile health. But the judge remained unmoved. Jonathan's funeral was held on May 22, 2012. Nearly 700 people came to mourn him. Friends, teachers, classmates, all gathered to celebrate the life of a teenager who brought laughter and joy to everyone around him. A boy who, by all accounts, was kind, intelligent, and deeply loved. But for his grandmother, Jonathan's imperfections, his struggles, made him unworthy of her patience, and in her eyes, he simply didn't belong.